Hello, my restful wanderers. I have been working on something behind the scenes that I am so excited about. And next week, I finally get to share it with all of you. So make sure you are following the channel. You will not want to miss this one. So, tonight, we follow the story of New Moon, but not through the eyes you might expect. We step back, and we see it all through Carlisle Cullen. The father, the physician, the man who has lived 3 centuries and built everything he loves, only to watch it begin to fracture. A son consumed by grief, a family scattered across the dark, and a choice drawing closer that cannot be unmade. So, get cozy. Pull your blankets a little tighter and let this story carry you gently into the night. The morning of Bella Swan's 18th birthday, Carlile sat in his study with a medical journal open across his knees and read the same paragraph 4 times, without absorbing a single word of it. This was unusual for him. In 3 centuries of existence, Carlile had developed the ability to occupy his mind completely with whatever task he had set before it. A discipline born from necessity in those early decades when distraction meant disaster, when losing focus for even a moment could cost a human life. He had trained himself into a kind of absolute present tense attention that served him well in operating rooms and emergency wards and every other context where precision mattered. His mind did not wander. It was one of the few genuine advantages of his particular immortality. This capacity for complete and undivided focus. And he had come to rely on it so thoroughly that its absence this particular morning felt significant in itself. But the journal stayed unread. Outside the study window, Fawkes lay wrapped in his customary grey, the clouds sitting low over the tree line, the kind of persistent overcast that made the town feel like it existed slightly outside of ordinary time, suspended in a perpetual soft dusk that suited its particular character. He'd come to find a certain peace in that greyness over the past 2 years. It suited the life they were building here, the careful and deliberate life his family maintained in this small, rain-softened corner of Washington. Other locations had offered easier concealment, larger populations, better access to the kind of wilderness that made their hunting unobtrusive. But Fawkes had given them something harder to quantify and more valuable than logistics. It had given them a version of stillness, a sense of being, if not home, then something that rhymed with it. He closed the journal and set it on the desk and allowed himself to think directly about what the day actually was. Bella Swan was turning 18. In every practical sense, this was a small and ordinary fact. Birthdays happened constantly, everywhere. to everyone, in the full and indifferent abundance of human time. Carlile had witnessed thousands of them across his long existence, had treated patients on their birthdays, had signed his name to cards in hospital break rooms for colleagues whose names he memorized immediately and would remember long after they had forgotten him. He was not unacquainted with the ritual of the birthday, with its particular combination of celebration and quiet stock-taking, the way humans use the annual marker to measure themselves against some imagined version of who they were supposed to have become by now. But Bella's birthday sat differently in his mind, and he did not try to talk himself out of that. He had learned across 3 centuries that the feelings that persisted through rational examination were usually the ones that deserved attention. And this one persisted. Bella was not simply a girl turning 18. She was the girl that Edward loved, which meant she was the girl Carlile had watched his son hold himself together for and hold himself back from and reinvent himself around across the better part of 2 years. She was the human at the center of an arrangement that should have been impossible, and had somehow, through the specific combination of Edward's will and Bella's extraordinary stubbornness, become real. And she was turning 18 in a house full of people who would never turn anything again. That was the cruelty embedded in the celebration, and Carlile could not stop himself from feeling it, even as he understood that Alice's intentions in organizing the party were entirely and genuinely loving. The cake she had ordered from a bakery in Port Angeles, the streamers in the colors Bella had mentioned once offhandedly in a conversation she had not realized Alice was memorizing. The carefully wrapped gifts stacked with geometric precision on the side table in the living room. All of it carried the implicit acknowledgement that they were celebrating her age in a room where age meant something only to her. Where the number 18 was, for Bella, a crossing of a threshold, and where, for everyone else in the room, it was a reminder. He had been the one to transform Edward, had been the one to freeze him at 17, to take from him the forward motion of a human life, the ordinary accumulation of years and experience and change. He had made that choice in the hospital hallway in Chicago in the autumn of 1918, with the boy's mother's voice still warm in his ears, and he had never regretted it. Not precisely, not in the way that regret usually presented itself. But he carried the weight of it the way he carried all the weights his long existence had accumulated, carefully, with full awareness, without the comfort of setting them down. And now he sat in his study on the morning of Bella's 18th birthday and felt that weight with particular clarity, the specific heaviness of watching the girl Edward loved move through time while Edward stood exactly still. He heard Alice downstairs long before he descended to find her, the quick, bright sounds of her moving through the living room with her characteristic focused energy, the soft impact of her feet against the floor as she climbed and repositioned and assessed. Alice approached decoration the way she approached most things, with complete commitment and the cool efficiency of someone who had already seen the finished result and was simply executing the vision she carried, closing the distance between the present moment and the image her gift had already delivered to her. Carlile listened to the sounds of her working and felt something warm move through him, despite the complicated tenor of the morning. Alice's joy, when it was genuine and uncomplicated, was one of the more beautiful things his long existence had produced. It was not a performance. Alice did not perform joy the way some people did, deploying it as social currency or protective cover. When she was happy, the happiness was real, and it filled whatever room she occupied with something that felt almost like light. He descended the stairs and found her standing on a chair she had no practical need for, her small frame fully extended toward the ceiling, where she was fixing something with the precision of someone for whom precision was not effort, but instinct. She glanced at him over her shoulder with the particular look she wore when her visions had already shown her the shape of the conversation they were about to have. He told her that everything looked wonderful, because it did, and because Alice deserved to hear it said plainly rather than implied. She smiled, and he saw beneath the smile the specific quality of her investment in this particular day. She loved Bella with the uncomplicated directness that was Alice's characteristic gift to the people she admitted into her affection. She had known Bella in her visions before she knew her as a person, had carried an image of this girl through years of her own existence before the girl herself arrived in Forks, and what had grown from that unusual beginning was a friendship Carlile found genuinely moving to observe. Alice wanted this day to be good for Bella. She wanted Bella to feel celebrated and loved and fully welcome in this house, not as a guest permitted by Edward's devotion, but as someone who belonged here in her own right. The decorations were not performance. They were sincerity made physical, care translated into the language of streamers and carefully sourced birthday candles. He found Esme in the kitchen, engaged in the rituals she maintained in kitchens, despite the fact that kitchens were not, strictly speaking, necessary for any of them. She had arranged the components of the birthday presentation across the counter with the quiet attentiveness she brought to all domestic tasks. The bakery box opened carefully at one end, the candle in the shape of the number 18 placed beside it with deliberate positioning, a small arrangement of flowers she had cut herself from her garden that morning, their stems trimmed to matching lengths, the colors chosen with the same eye she brought to everything she created. She was adjusting and readjusting with the focused care of someone for whom the arrangement of things was a form of expression, which Carlile had come to understand, years into their marriage, was precisely what it was. Esme could not give Bella warmth in the literal physical sense. She could not offer her the human comfort of shared food or shared aging, or the ordinary domestic bonds that human families built across shared time. But she could make the table beautiful, and she could ensure that every visible surface of the house communicated welcome. And that was what she was doing on the morning of Bella's birthday, with the same seriousness she brought to everything she loved. He stood in the kitchen doorway and watched her for a moment before she turned and found him there. The look that crossed her face was the one he knew as well as any expression in his long existence, the one that held both the tenderness and the undercurrent of sorrow, braided so thoroughly together that they had become a single feeling. They had been together long enough to conduct entire conversations through the quality of silence between them, and this was one of those silences. He crossed the kitchen and stood beside her, and she leaned briefly against him, and the moment held what neither of them needed to put into words. He moved through the house in the hours before the party, attending to each of his family members with the particular attention brought to people he loved. when he sensed that the day ahead would require something from all of them. Emmett he found in the larger living area, already in good spirits in the uncomplicated way that Emmett reliably managed regardless of the emotional complexity surrounding him. He had already formulated several jokes about the mathematical oddity of Bella being 18 to Edward's perpetual 17. Jokes that he delivered to Carlile with the cheerful confidence of someone who had not yet had the opportunity to deploy them on their intended target. Carlile received them with the patient affection he had developed for Emmett's particular humor across the decades, understanding it for what it was. Emmett was not oblivious to the difficulty of the day's emotional terrain. He simply believed, with a sincerity that Carlile had come to find more philosophically serious than it initially appeared, that moving through difficulty at high speed and with maximum noise was preferable to standing still in it. There was wisdom in that position that Carlile had stopped underestimating. Jasper he found in the back of the house, standing at the window that faced the forest, his posture carrying the concentrated quality of someone engaged in an internal exercise demanding sustained effort. Carlile understood without needing to ask, and did not interrupt the exercise. Jasper was preparing himself for the afternoon, the way a surgeon prepares before a complicated procedure, not because he doubted his abilities, but because the complexity of what he was managing deserved the full respect of advanced preparation. Any gathering involving Bella required this of Jasper, the deliberate and methodical marshalling of his control, the careful pre-positioning of his empathic gift so that it served as a stabilizer rather than an amplifier. His ability to feel and influence the emotional atmosphere of any room was extraordinary, and in ordinary circumstances it was among the most useful gifts any of them possessed. In circumstances involving fresh human blood, it created a feedback loop that could overwhelm even his considerable discipline if he was not fully prepared going into the situation. Carlile communicated his awareness and his confidence briefly, without making it into more than it needed to be, and left Jasper to his preparation. Rosalie was not present in the common areas of the house, and Carlile noted this without surprise and without judgment, though with the particular quality of compassion that her situation had always produced in him. Rosalie's relationship to Bella's existence in their lives was the most painful dynamic in the household to observe from the outside, not because Rosalie was cruel in her nature. She was not fundamentally, whatever surface behaviors occasionally suggested otherwise, but because Bella's humanity cost Rosalie something real simply by being visible. Every aspect of Bella's ordinary human life, the warmth of her, the forward motion of her years, the possibility of children and aging, and the full arc of a human story, reminded Rosalie of what had been taken from her without consent in an alley in Rochester in 1933. Carlile did not fault Rosalie for protecting herself from that reminder by staying away from its source. He held a quiet and patient hope that time would eventually soften what proximity could not yet bridge, and in the meantime he respected the distance she needed. Edward he had not yet seen that morning, but he did not require sight to have a sense of his son's state. He had been observing Edward for weeks, with the specific attention he brought to any patient whose condition was developing along a trajectory that concerned him. The joy was genuinely there. He would not minimize it or dismiss it because it had been one of the more remarkable things he had witnessed in a long existence that contained many remarkable things. The return of Edward's music to the house after decades of silence. The quality of his attention when Bella was present. The way his whole being oriented toward her with a completeness that made clear she was not simply someone he loved, but someone who had become, in the truest sense, necessary to him. The occasional laughter that Carlile had not heard from Edward in longer than most human lives lasted, but something had been accumulating alongside the joy in recent weeks, and Carlyle's long experience reading human and vampire conditions made it impossible to ignore. A guardedness in Edward's bearing that had not been there 6 months earlier. A quality of bracing, as though some part of him was always slightly tensed against an impact he had already concluded was coming. Carlile had examined this observation from several angles and kept arriving at the same tentative conclusion, which he held lightly because he was a man who tried not to build certainties from insufficient evidence. But the observation persisted, and the things that persisted through careful examination were usually the things that deserved to be taken seriously. Bella arrived in the late afternoon, her truck audible from a considerable distance before the familiar engine sound resolved into tires on the drive. Carlile was at the door as she came up the front steps, managing the timing with the naturalness he had developed across centuries of performing human social behavior. She came up to the house with the careful movement of someone trying to appear less nervous than she was, which Carlile recognized immediately and found endearing in the way he found most of Bella's characteristic behaviors endearing. The stoicism, the self-minimizing, the preference for taking up less space than she was fully entitled to occupy. He welcomed her in the way he always welcomed her, with genuine warmth, expressed at the precise level that communicated care without tipping into the overwhelming, because Bella's comfort in a space always mattered to him, and he had learned by careful observation exactly what made her comfortable and what made her retreat into herself. He watched her move through the living room, taking in Alice's decorations with an expression that moved through several registers in quick succession. The first, involuntary pleasure at color and care. The second, self-conscious awareness of being the object of all of it. The third, and settling response of someone choosing to receive love graciously even when receiving love was not entirely comfortable. It was a sequence Carlile had observed in Bella before, in smaller and larger versions, and it told him something true about her that he had come to hold with particular tenderness. She was not practiced at being loved lavishly, but she was trying to learn because the people offering it mattered to her enough to try. He watched her with Alice, and with Esme, and with Emmett, and he watched Edward watching her, and in the quality of Edward's attention, there was the full complex frequency of everything Edward felt, available to Carlyle's long experience of reading his son, the way a musician reads a score they have studied for most of a century. The love was there, steady and enormous and real, and underneath it, present in the slight tightness of Edward's jaw and the carefulness of his posture, the thing Carlile had been tracking for weeks, the bracing, the dread of something unnamed. He could not source the specific anticipation that moved through his own awareness as the gift-opening portion of the evening began. He had no particular premonition, no focused sense of alarm directed at anything specific. It was the diffuse, atmospheric awareness that his long experience of crises had installed in him. The physician's sensitivity to the quality of a room in the moments before something shifts within it. He noted it and maintained his position and attended to the warmth of the gathering, because attending to warmth was also a form of care, and care was what the evening called for. The paper gave a small, sharp resistance, and then the edge caught her finger, and the sound of it was almost nothing at all. The smell arrived in the same breath. Carlile registered it with the full trained precision of 3 centuries of practice. The copper-bright, acutely alive scent of fresh human blood opening into the enclosed air of the room, like a wave moving outward from a single source. His control engaged in the same instant, automatically, without requiring the intermediate step of conscious decision, the way any sufficiently practiced skill eventually relocates itself below the threshold of deliberate thought. It cost him something to engage it at that concentration and in that proximity. It always cost him something. The cost had never disappeared across 300 years of practice, only become more manageable, more reliably containable. He paid it now without allowing it to show, and did not move from where he stood. What he saw in the fraction of a second that followed told him everything about everyone else in the room simultaneously. Jasper moved. The movement was not a choice, so much as the momentary failure of the gap between instinct and restraint, the deep animal architecture of his nature briefly overriding the decades of discipline layered over it through enormous effort and enormous cost. Jasper had done everything that could be done by way of preparation for this afternoon. The fact that it had not been sufficient was not a commentary on his character or his effort. It was a commentary on the concentration of Bella's specific blood in the specific enclosed warmth of that room, which was beyond the range of what any reasonable preparation could guarantee against. Carlile understood this with perfect clarity, and what he felt for Jasper in that fraction of a second was not alarm, but the particular deep compassion of someone who has spent 3 centuries understanding the difference between the failure of will and the simple overwhelming of the possible. Edward moved to place himself between Jasper and Bella, the protective instinct so immediate it preceded anything like conscious decision, and the force of it sent Bella backward into the side table. Everything came apart at once. The crystal, the glasses, the careful accumulation of the afternoon's preparation, all of it dissolving into the sharp sound of breakage. Bella went down against the debris, and the new wounds were immediate, and the quality of the smell in the room became something that even Carlyle's long-built and rigorously maintained resistance had to actively work against. He was already in motion, not fast, not in the way that would have betrayed what he was to any human observer, but without hesitation and without the detour of shock. He moved to Bella with the calm authority that 3 centuries of emergency medicine had taught him was the single most useful thing he could offer in a moment of acute crisis. Not urgency, because urgency fed panic in a room already full of it. Not softness, because softness could collapse under pressure at precisely the moment when holding was required. Authority, the specific calm certainty of someone who has seen worse and managed it and already knows, before the full picture is assembled, what the next correct action is. He assessed her from a crouch beside her, eyes moving rapidly across the lacerations, hands finding her wrist, cataloguing the damage with the efficient speed of someone for whom this assessment is as automatic as breathing is for humans. His hands were steady. His voice, when he spoke to clear the room and communicate his intentions, was steady. Everything visible about him was steady, because steadiness in the physician was the first and most immediate medicine available in a moment like this one. He needed to move her out of this room. He said so clearly and without elaboration, because clarity was what the moment required, and he lifted her with the care that the specific combination of her injuries and his strength demanded. Not the full strength, never that, but the lower register of it that allowed for gentleness. The walk through the house to his study was one of the more demanding things he had asked of himself in recent memory, and the demand was not physical. The physical component was manageable. What he was managing as he moved was layered and complex. The immediate sensory challenge of proximity to freely flowing blood at close range and sustained duration. The sounds of the household behind him as family members managed their own responses with varying degrees of success. And underneath all of it, occupying a specific and carefully partitioned space in his awareness, the image of Edward's face in the moment before Carlile turned away to lift Bella. In the study, with the door closed and the air more contained, he worked. His medical bag was where it always was, and it contained everything the situation required, because Carlile had long since made a practice of being prepared for the varieties of crisis that proximity to both his family and to human medicine tended to produce. He cleaned the wounds with the thoroughness he brought to any patient's care. He talked to Bella throughout the process, not about the accident, not about what had happened in the living room or what it meant, but about smaller and more ordinary things, the quiet reassurance of a voice that expected her to be fine, because she was going to be fine, and his voice knew it. She bore the stitching with the stoicism he had come to understand as her characteristic mode of managing physical discomfort. She did not perform pain, did not amplify it outward, but absorb it inward with a self-containment that told him something about how she had learned to experience difficulty across her life. He respected it as the coping strategy it was, while noting it as a physician. People who did not report their pain accurately were sometimes the ones who needed the most careful watching. He was aware of Edward in the room throughout. Edward had followed them and had positioned himself in the corner with his back partly turned to the work Carlile was doing, which was the correct instinct and the correctly executed version of it. Carlile did not ask him to leave. Edward needed to be present in the same way that certain patients needed to remain conscious during a procedure, even when unconsciousness would have been easier. Because what was happening needed to be witnessed, needed to be real, needed to be integrated rather than avoided. He worked and he stitched, and when the clinical work was finished and the wounds were clean and closed, he sat with Bella for a moment longer than the medicine strictly required. He answered her questions about the stitches and the healing and what she could expect in the coming days, and he was honest with her in the way he was always honest with patients, which was to say without omission and without the softening distortions that some physicians employed because they believed honesty was harder for patients to bear than its alternatives. Carlile had never subscribed to that position. He believed people deserved accurate information about themselves, full stop, and he extended that belief to Bella without reservation. She thanked him quietly and with genuine feeling, in the way she thanked people when she meant it, rather than when she was observing the social form. He walked her back to the living room when she was ready. Edward took her home. Carlile stood at the window of the front room and watched the car move down the drive and disappear into the grey of the Forks evening. Then he stood there a moment longer, his hand not quite touching the glass, the room behind him settling into the particular quality of quiet that follows the departure of the person around whom a whole complicated evening has organized itself. Esme came and stood beside him. She did not speak because she understood, as she almost always understood, that what this moment required was not words but presence. He felt her beside him and was grateful for it with the full depth of what that gratitude meant after 3.5 centuries together. The simple and enormous anchor of being known completely by another person who had chosen to remain. He thought about Edward's face, the blankness that had settled there in the last minutes before he ushered Bella out of the house. Not the blankness of shock, not the blankness of someone processing an unexpected event, something older than shock, the blankness of a conclusion reached. He had seen it before. He had seen it in 1927, in the weeks before Edward left Carlisle for the first time. That specific quality of internal resolution that preceded Edward's most consequential decisions. He had seen it in smaller versions at various points across the 86 years he had known his son, and he had learned to read it the way he read any significant diagnostic indicator, not with alarm that obscured clear thinking, but with the steady attention that the significance deserved. Standing at the window in the darkening evening of Bella Swan's 18th birthday, Carlile held what he already knew, with the patience of someone who has learned that knowing a thing and being able to prevent a thing are not the same, and that the distance between them is where most of the real difficulty of loving someone actually lives. The days between the birthday party and Edward's departure had a particular quality that Carlile recognized from his long experience of watching people approach the edges of themselves. It was not the quality of crisis, which had its own distinct atmosphere, the urgency, the noise, the compressed energy of people reacting to something that had already happened. This was quieter than crisis. It was the quality of inevitability, the long, still exhale before the thing that cannot be stopped arrives. Edward stopped feeding properly within 2 days of the party. Carlile noted this the way he noted any symptom, without alarm that would compromise his assessment, but with the steady clinical attention that significant indicators deserved. The darkening at the edges of Edward's eyes was gradual at first, the kind of change that a less observant person might attribute to the quality of the light in a particular room or the time of day. Carlile was not a less observant person. He'd been reading Edward's physical condition for 86 years with the dual attention of a physician and a father, and the combination of those two ways of seeing made it impossible to miss. He did not raise it immediately. He had learned, over the many decades of knowing Edward, that Edward's relationship to direct concern was complicated. Too much of it, offered too soon, produced the exact opposite of the intended effect. A closing off, a polite and impenetrable retreat behind the careful courtesy that Edward had learned to deploy as a form of self-protection. Carlile had made the mistake of pushing through that courtesy more than once in their long history together, and the results had consistently confirmed what the pattern suggested. receive help when he was ready to receive it, and engineering the moment of readiness was not within anyone else's power. What Carlile could do, and what he did, was make himself available. He kept his study door open. He arranged his schedule so that the hours he spent in the house overlapped with the hours Edward was most likely to be in it. He was present, consistently and without commentary, in the way that he had learned was the form of care Edward could most reliably accept. He attempted a conversation about hunting on the third day, framing it as his own desire to go out, rather than a prescription for Edward, which was a transparent construction that Edward certainly saw through, and which Carlile offered anyway, because the transparency of it was not the point. The point was the door it held open. Edward declined with a quiet politeness that was worse, in some ways, than an argument would have been. An argument would have meant engagement. The politeness meant Edward was already somewhere Carlile could not quite reach. He spoke with Esme in the evenings, in the privacy of their room, with the door closed and their voices held to the register that only they could hear. These were not the comfortable late-night conversations that constituted much of the texture of their long marriage, the easy exchanges of the day's observations, and the small warmths of shared domestic life. These were the harder conversations, the ones that required both of them to say plainly what they were afraid of, and to hold it together rather than apart. Esme's grief was immediate and embodied, present in her face and her posture, and the way she held her hands when she spoke about what she was watching Edward become. She was not a person who managed feeling at a distance. She felt with her whole self, which was one of the things Carlile loved most about her, and which made these conversations require something from him. The steadiness she needed him to maintain, while also being honest about his own fear. His fear was more clinical in its presentation, which did not mean it was smaller. He told her plainly what he believed Edward was considering. He told her the basis for that belief, the specific indicators, the pattern of withdrawal, the quality of the blankness he had observed in Edward's face on the evening of the party. Esme listened with the focused attention she gave to things that mattered, and when he finished, she was quiet for a long moment, and then she said that she did not want to believe it, and he told her that she did not have to believe it yet, that he could be wrong, but that he was telling her because she deserved to know what he was seeing. She reached across the space between them and took his hand, and they sat with it together, the knowledge and the not quite knowing, in the way that people who love each other sit with difficult things. The conversation with Alice happened on the 5th day, and it confirmed what Carlile had been holding as a tentative conclusion. Alice had been restless in the way she became restless when her visions were showing her things she did not want to see. A particular quality of agitation beneath her surface composure, the way she moved through the house with slightly more speed than usual, as though staying in motion might prevent the stillness that visions required, and that she was currently reluctant to invite. Carlile found her in the kitchen, engaged in the unnecessary reorganization of a cabinet that had not required reorganization, and he simply waited until she turned and found him standing there. What she told him was not the full content of what she had seen, because Alice was careful with her visions in the way that someone carrying heavy things learns to be careful about how they set them down. But she told him enough. The future she was seeing for Edward was not a future that kept him in forks. She could not yet see the specific shape of what came next, only the broad and terrible outline of it. She looked at Carlile with the expression of someone wanting to be told that what they are seeing is wrong, and he did not tell her that, because he could not tell her something he did not know to be true. Edward came to him on the 7th day. He came to the study in the early evening, when the house had settled into the quiet of after-dinner hours, and he knocked on the open door with the particular quality of knock that communicated he had something to say and had decided to say it. Carlile set down what he was reading and indicated the chair across from his desk, the one that Edward had occupied hundreds of times across their long history, and Edward sat in it with the careful composure of someone who had been rehearsing what they were about to say and was now committed to the delivery. He stated his intention plainly. This was characteristic of Edward at his most resolved, the directness that emerged when the decision was already made, when he was not looking for counsel so much as for the conversation that would complete the decision's reality. He was going to leave Fawkes. He was going to leave the family, and he was going to leave Bella. He explained his reasoning with the same directness. The birthday party had demonstrated, in the most concrete terms available, what he had been fearing for longer than he had allowed himself to articulate. His proximity to Bella was not a controlled risk. It was an ongoing and inherent danger that her love for him and his love for her would continue to generate in the form of situations that placed her in harm's way, not through accident or external threat, but through the fundamental incompatibility of what they were. He was a vampire, she was human. The birthday party was not an aberration. It was a pattern made visible. Carlile listened to all of it without interrupting, which was the agreement he had made with himself before Edward entered the room. He had understood, from the moment he heard the knock, that this conversation was not one in which Edward was asking for Carlile's conclusion. He was asking in the way that people who have already decided sometimes still need to ask, for the space to be heard. Carlile gave him that space fully, and when Edward finished, he was quiet for a long moment before he responded. He did not argue against the reasoning. He had examined it himself across the days of watching Edward's withdrawal, and he could not, in honesty, find the fundamental logic of it unsound. The danger was real. The birthday party had made it unignorable. He understood the argument, and he could not dismiss it. What he challenged was the method. He said it as directly as Edward had spoken, because Edward deserved the same directness in return, and because anything less would have been a disrespect to the seriousness of what they were discussing. Leaving without honest farewell was a form of cruelty, regardless of the intention behind it. Bella Swan was not a person who would be protected from pain by being denied the truth of its cause. She was a person of unusual emotional intelligence and unusual courage, and what she deserved was the honesty of knowing what was happening and why, so that she could grieve it clearly, rather than spending years in the corrosive uncertainty of not knowing. Edward's response was quiet, and Carlile could hear the product of its own painful consideration. He said that he knew this. He said that if he said goodbye honestly, Bella would ask him to stay. And he said that if she asked him to stay, he would not be strong enough to refuse her, because the specific quality of his love for her made her refusal more powerful than his resolve. He would stay because she asked him to, and staying would place her in continued danger, and the love that made him stay would be the same love that ultimately failed to protect her. Carlile sat with this for a longer moment than he usually permitted himself in difficult conversations, because it required the longer moment. What Edward was describing was not irrational. It was, in his own terrible way, a completely coherent account of the specific bind that his love for Bella had created. He wasn't choosing between staying and leaving. He was choosing between two versions of harm, and he had concluded that the harm of leaving was smaller, ultimately, than the harm of staying. And he'd concluded further that the only way to leave was to do it without the conversation that would prevent him from going. Carlile did not tell him he was right. He did not tell him he was wrong. He told him finally that he trusted Edward's capacity to know his own limits, and that he respected the love behind the decision even as he mourned the decision itself. And then he asked one thing, that whatever Edward did, he'd do it knowing that the door would remain open, that leaving Fawkes did not mean leaving the family, that there was no version of Edward's future in which he was not still Carlisle's son, completely and without condition. Edward's composure, which had held throughout the conversation with the careful rigidity of something very tightly maintained, shifted slightly at this. Not breaking. Edward did not break easily, but softening at the edges in a way that Carlile recognized as the response of someone who has been holding themselves together through an extended act of will and has just been told by someone whose words carry weight that the holding together is not required. He nodded once, and then he stood, and Carlile stood as well, and the embrace that followed was the kind that happens between people who have been through enough together to understand that some things cannot be said better than they can be held. The conversations with the other family members took place across the remaining days before the departure, each one requiring its own specific approach, because each person's grief had its own specific character. Alice was the most difficult, not because she was least able to manage difficulty, but because she was the most transparent about the full depth of what she was feeling. She was devastated, and she did not conceal it from Carlile the way she sometimes concealed difficult feelings from the rest of the family. Perhaps because she understood that concealment from Carlile was rarely worth the effort. She was angry at Edward with the specific anger of someone who loves deeply and has been failed by that love. And she was frightened for Bella in a way that went beyond concern, into something closer to dread. Her visions of Bella's immediate future carrying a quality that Alice described to Carlile with careful precision, and which produced in him his own version of dread. He addressed her anger honestly, validating its source without encouraging its direction. And he addressed the fear with the only thing he had available, which was his own willingness to share it, rather than diminish it. Jasper received the news with the stoic acceptance that his military training had made his characteristic response to things he could not change. But Carlile heard beneath the stoicism the specific weight that Jasper carried about the birthday party, the self-blame that had settled over him since that evening with the tenacity of something that intended to stay. He addressed this directly and at length, not to absolve Jasper of the difficulty of what had happened, because absolution was not what the situation called for, but to dismantle the architecture of the self-blame carefully and honestly, piece by piece, until what remained was the more accurate and more livable truth, that Jasper had done everything that could be done, and that what had occurred was the product of circumstances beyond the reach of any amount of preparation. Emmett's response was the loudest and the most immediately physical, which was characteristic and which Carlile had long since learned to receive on his own terms. He wanted to confront Edward directly, to make the case in the way Emmett made cases, with volume and force and the unsubtle deployment of his considerable presence. Carlile redirected this with the patience that Emmett specifically required, not dismissing the protective fury behind it, but channeling it towards something more useful. Emmett's love for Edward was real and enormous, expressed through a medium that was not always recognizable as love from the outside, but which Carlile had learned to read accurately. He let Emmett say everything he needed to say, and then he asked him to trust Edward, and then he asked him to trust the family's ability to hold together through what was coming. Emmett was quiet for a moment, which for Emmett was the equivalent of a very long silence in anyone else, and then he said that he did not like it. Carlile told him that he did not like it either. He went to Rosalie last, and their conversation was the briefest and in some ways the most complicated. Rosalie's reaction to the news of Edward's departure was the one he had predicted with the least confidence, because Rosalie's emotional landscape around anything involving Bella was layered in ways that resisted simple prediction. What he found when he sat with her was a surface composure that covered genuine sorrow, that covered something he identified with his long experience of Rosalie's inner weather as relief. Not the relief of someone glad of an outcome, but the relief of someone who has been carrying a tension that is now resolving, even in a painful direction. And beneath the relief, layered under all of it, guilt about the relief. He did not name any of this aloud. He simply sat with her and told her that the family would hold together, and that she was part of the family without condition, and that whatever she was feeling was allowed to be exactly what it was. She received this with the complicated dignity that was Rosalie's characteristic way of receiving care from Carlile, which was to say imperfectly, and with the slight stiffness of someone unaccustomed to being fully met, but genuinely, underneath all of it, genuinely. The morning of the departure arrived the way mornings arrive when something irreversible is scheduled to happen within them, with an ordinary quality that sat wrongly against the weight of what the day contained. The light through the windows was the same grey as any other Forks morning. The sounds of the house were the same. Everything that was about to change was doing so invisibly, underneath the ordinary surface of the day. Carlile knew when Edward went into the forest with Bella, he did not follow. He had made his peace with not being able to prevent what was about to happen, and following would not have constituted prevention. It would have constituted witness, and this was not a moment that belonged to witness. It belonged to Edward and to Bella, and whatever happened in the forest between them was theirs, whatever it cost. He was in his study when Edward returned, and he heard the front door before he heard anything else. The particular quality of its closing, which was not the ordinary quality of a door closing behind someone who had been out and was now home, but the quality of a door closing behind someone who has just performed an act they cannot take back and are now on the other side of it. He did not go to Edward immediately. He gave him the minutes that the moment required, the brief, private interval between the action and the encounter with anyone who loved him, because even the most necessary things deserve a moment of being survived before they are witnessed. When he went to the hallway, Edward was standing near the foot of the stairs with the expression Carlile had been dreading since the 7th day after the birthday party. It was the blankness he had predicted, and predicting it had not made seeing it any easier. It was not the blankness of shock or of grief, or of any of the recognizable emotional states that blankness typically concealed. It was the blankness of someone who has performed a surgery on themselves and has not yet left the operating room, who is still in the middle of the procedure, managing the bleeding before allowing the wound to be real. They looked at each other for a moment without speaking, and then Carlile crossed the hallway and put his hand on Edward's shoulder, and the contact was enough, for now, to say what the moment did not have language for. The Cullen house was emptied with the efficiency that a family of 7 immortals could bring to any task that required speed. Boxes were unnecessary because possessions were few, and what seemed like a household was, when reduced to its components, a relatively modest collection of the things that 7 people had decided they could not live without. Esme moved through the rooms with a particular kind of attention, her hand touching surfaces as she passed them. The kitchen counter, the window frame in the living room, the wall beside the front door where Edward's concert programs were pinned. She was saying goodbye in the way Esme said goodbye to places she had cared for, which was quietly and without ceremony, and with her whole heart. Carlile took his last walk through the house alone. He moved through it slowly, which was unusual for him. A man who had left dozens of homes across 3 centuries and had long since learned to perform the leaving efficiently without the prolonged backward look that made transitions harder rather than easier. But this house earned the slow walk. The study where he had sat with Edward through 100 different conversations. The piano in the corner of the living room that had, for a period, been the sound of Edward being well. The glass walls that made the forest feel like it was inside with them. The particular grey and green of it. The way rain moved through the trees. He stood at the front door before closing it for the last time, and looked back at the empty rooms and felt the full weight of what they were leaving, which was not simply a house. It was the shape of a life they had been building, a particular version of home that had felt, across the 2 years they had spent here, like something that might actually last. He closed the door. He drove with Esme in the first car, following Alice and Jasper, with Emmett and Rosalie behind them. Edward drove alone in the Volvo, which Carlile had thought about and had decided not to address, because solitude was sometimes the correct prescription, even when it looked like isolation, and the work of knowing the difference was one of the longer projects of his life. The town of Forks disappeared behind them with the speed of a short drive on familiar roads, and then it was simply gone, replaced by a highway and the grey continuity of the Pacific Northwest winter, and Carlile drove forward into it with the patience that 300 years had installed in him as the bedrock of his character. He had left many things behind. He had always survived the leaving, and he had learned, not easily but thoroughly, that survival was the prerequisite for everything that came after, and that everything that came after was worth surviving for. But he allowed himself once, in the privacy of the car with Esme beside him, to feel the full weight of what the day had been, not the physician's managed version of it, the actual weight, and he held it for precisely as long as the holding was honest. eyes on the road ahead and drove. Carlile chose Ithaca the way he had chosen most of the places his family had lived across the decades, with the careful pragmatism of someone who has learned that the practical requirements of concealment and the emotional requirements of a livable life do not always point in the same direction, and that the best locations are the ones where they overlap sufficiently to make the compromise workable. He had been making this calculation for 3 centuries, had developed a practiced eye for the particular combination of institutional infrastructure, population density, and climatic conditions that allowed his family to exist within a human community, without drawing the kind of sustained attention that ultimately required another move. He was good at it. The goodness was not something he took particular pride in, because the skill itself was an accommodation to a limitation, rather than a genuine achievement, but he was grateful for it in the way he was grateful for all the practical competencies that made the life he had chosen more sustainable. Ithaca offered a university hospital with a research division, substantial enough to absorb a physician of his apparent age, and evident competence without the kind of careful scrutiny that smaller institutions tended to apply to new arrivals. It offered a campus population large enough that the Cullen family's presence would register as unremarkable. Students and faculty cycled through with the regularity that made new faces a constant, rather than an occasion for community speculation. The university itself created a kind of social architecture that suited them, a place where intelligence and slight eccentricity were not liabilities, where people were accustomed to encountering the unusual without feeling compelled to categorize it. And it offered the kind of winter that kept skies heavy and overcast for months at a time, which remained, as it had always been, the most fundamental environmental requirement his family could not negotiate around. Sunlight was the one variable that no amount of careful social management could compensate for, and Ithaca's winters gave them the freedom of movement that sunlight denied. He did not choose it because it felt like home. He was honest with himself about this, because honesty about his own condition had been one of the disciplines he had cultivated most deliberately across 3 centuries of self-examination. And he had learned that the small self-deceptions, the ones that seemed harmless because they were minor, had a tendency to accumulate into something more structurally significant if left unexamined. Ithaca did not feel like home. Nowhere felt like home in the weeks following their departure from Forks, and he understood clearly that this was not a problem of location. No arrangement of geography was going to resolve what geography had not caused. He chose Ithaca because it was functional, and because functional was the category of good that was available to him at that particular moment in the family's life. And he had learned across a very long time that accepting the available good, rather than refusing it on the grounds that it fell short of the ideal, was one of the more important disciplines a long existence demanded. Esme threw herself into the house the moment they arrived, and Carlile watched her do it with the particular gratitude of someone who understood what the throwing herself in actually was. This was her way, and had been her way across every relocation they had undertaken together across the decades of their marriage, and he had come to understand it not as a coping mechanism in the diminished sense that term sometimes implied, but as one of the most honest expressions of who Esme was. She processed transition through architecture. She processed loss through the restoration of broken things. She transformed grief into the act of creation, because creation was the form her love most naturally took, and when the people she loved were hurting in ways she could not directly reach. Making their physical world more beautiful and more livable was the most immediate and genuine thing she could offer. The house they acquired on the outskirts of Ithaca was large and old, and had been neglected in the specific ways that old houses accumulate neglect when they pass through several owners in quick succession, each one arriving with intentions toward the deferred maintenance and departing before those intentions became action. The foundation was sound and the bones were good. Esme walked through the rooms in the first hour with the rapid, comprehensive assessment of someone who had been doing this for decades and knew immediately what she was working with. The superficial damage was extensive. Plasterwork that needed significant attention. Floors that had been buried under successive layers of inappropriate covering. Windows that had been painted shut by someone who had never understood what the windows were for. All of it was repairable. All of it was, in fact, exactly the kind of work that required sustained attention and physical effort, and the ongoing satisfaction of visible progress. Carlile understood, watching her move through the rooms on that first day, that the house was not incidental to Esme's recovery from the difficulty of what the family was living through. The house was part of the medicine. He did not offer to help with the work itself, because he understood that the help she needed was not practical. It was present. He stayed near her. He brought her the coffee she did not require, and sat in whatever room she was working in, reading or writing or simply being there, and the being there was its own form of participation. When she wanted to talk, he was available to talk. When she needed the quiet of focused work, he provided the company of someone who respected the quiet. He had learned this particular calibration across many decades of knowing Esme. The specific balance between presence and space that she needed in her difficult seasons, and he applied it now with the care of long practice. He returned to the hospital within 2 weeks of their arrival in Ithaca, and the return was not a decision he spent significant time deliberating over. It was more like the recognition of a necessity that had been true from the beginning. The understanding that meaningful work was the most reliable anchor available to him in the absence of the particular fullness that Fawkes had briefly offered, and that allowing the anchor to go unused would be a form of self-neglect that would compound rather than accommodate the difficulty he was already managing. He had been a physician for the better part of 3 centuries, and whatever else had shifted or diminished or been lost in the weeks since they left Fawkes, the work remained what it had always been, the one context in which his immortality functioned as an uncomplicated gift rather than a complication requiring constant management. At the hospital, his enhanced senses made him better rather than more dangerous. His perfect memory meant he never missed a detail in a patient's history, never failed to connect a current presentation to a relevant prior incident, never lost track of the thread of a complex case across the weeks or months of his development. His inability to tire meant he could work double shifts during crisis periods without the degradation of judgment that exhaustion produced in his human colleagues, without the errors that accumulated at the edges of human endurance. He could smell illness in ways that no diagnostic technology had yet replicated, could hear the specific qualities of cardiac rhythms that even experienced cardiologists sometimes missed. The gifts that made ordinary human life difficult, the thirst, the strength, the sensory overload of crowded spaces, became, in the hospital context, either manageable or genuinely useful. And the work itself, the specific act of moving toward human suffering with the intention of relieving it, remained the most direct expression of the life philosophy he had built across 300 years of trying to do his existence justice. His new colleagues received him with the warm efficiency of an institution that needed good physicians and had learned not to look too carefully at the ones it found. His credentials were, as they always were, impeccable. Carlile had been maintaining the infrastructure of professional legitimacy for long enough that the process was as practiced and as automatic as any other aspect of his human performance, executed with the thoroughness of someone who understood that the details were not optional. His colleagues were the ordinary mixture of the dedicated and the exhausted, and the quietly exceptional that he found in every hospital he had worked in across the centuries, and he moved among them with the ease of long practice, learning their names immediately, reading their professional rhythms and personal pressures with the acuity of someone who had spent 3 centuries developing a comprehensive understanding of how people worked under sustained stress. The work helped. He was honest enough with himself to say this plainly, at least in the privacy of his own thoughts. It helped in the specific and limited way that meaningful occupation helps anyone managing grief, not by resolving the grief or diminishing its actual weight, but by giving the hours of the day a structure that did not require grief to be the organizing principle of every waking moment. He was useful at the hospital, visibly and measurably useful, and that visibility mattered in the way that evidence of one's own purpose always matters when the larger question of purpose has been temporarily obscured by loss. He observed the family with the ongoing attention he brought to all of them across the months in Ithaca, the physician's eye and the father's eye working together as they always had, sometimes in harmony and sometimes in productive tension. The clinical assessment and the emotional response informing each other in the way that good medicine and genuine love always do when they are both present in the same person. Alice was the family member whose diminishment was most immediately visible, and therefore the one whose condition he monitored most carefully in the early months. Her visions had changed in Bella's absence, not ceased, because Alice's gift was not contingent on any single person's presence in her life, but altered in a quality that Carlile observed from the outside with the careful attention of someone trying to understand a phenomenon they cannot directly access. The brightness that had characterized her visions during the Fawkes period, the particular quality of engaged certainty she had carried when Bella was part of the landscape of the future she was seeing, had given way to something flatter, more effortful. She still moved through the days with energy, because Alice's energy was constitutional rather than circumstantial, and did not simply disappear in the face of difficulty. But the energy was working harder now, against more resistance, and the difference was visible to someone who had known her long enough to read the distinction. She called Bella. She did this from the beginning of their time in Ithaca, with a frequency that she did not discuss openly with the family and that Carlile was aware of through the ordinary channels of a house where privacy was architecturally challenging, rather than through any deliberate monitoring. He chose to say nothing about the calls, and his choice was deliberate and considered. Whatever the terms of the family's departure from Fawkes had been, whatever Edward's intentions about the completeness of the break, Alice's bond with Bella was its own distinct relationship, and it carried its own distinct weight. It had existed before their arrival in Fawkes in Alice's visions, had developed into something genuine and particular across the months of Bella's time there, and it deserved to be honoured on its own terms rather than subordinated to the larger narrative of Edward's departure. Carlile understood this, and he let Alice make her calls, and he said nothing about them to Edward in his letters, and he considered both of these choices the correct ones. Jasper's guilt had settled into him with the tenacity of something that had identified a hospitable environment and intended to stay. Carlile could see it in the specific quality of Jasper's self-containment during this period, the way he managed the household's emotional climate with his usual skill and thoroughness, while directing very little of that skillful attention toward himself. Jasper was extraordinarily good at managing other people's feelings and considerably less practiced at applying the same quality of attention to his own, which was a pattern Carlile had observed in him from the beginning of his time with the family, and which he understood as the legacy of Jasper's particular history. Decades of military discipline, and then decades of a different kind of discipline, both of which had rewarded the management of feeling over its honest examination. Carlile addressed Jasper's guilt across a series of conversations that were not dramatic confrontations or structured therapeutic sessions, but the quiet, incremental work of returning to a subject across enough time and in enough different formulations that the person being addressed eventually found one of them they could receive. He did not tell Jasper that what had happened at the birthday party was entirely without his responsibility, because the absolute version of that statement would not have survived contact with Jasper's own careful honesty about what he knew of himself and his limits. He told him instead what was more precisely true, that the gap between what Jasper had prepared for and what the birthday party had produced was not a gap that reflected inadequacy of effort or character, but the simple and painful reality that some circumstances exceed the reach of any preparation, and that the moral weight of what falls into that gap belongs to the circumstance rather than to the person who prepared as thoroughly as preparation allows. He told him this in various registers across various conversations, and Jasper received it with the careful skepticism of someone who wanted to believe it and was building toward being able to, and Carlile was patient with the process, because patience was genuinely what it required, and because Jasper deserved the patience applied without reservation. Emmett moved through the Ithaca months the way Emmett moved through all of his difficult seasons, through the physical world, with tremendous energy and a kind of determined cheerfulness that was not as simple as it appeared. He organized hunting trips with the comprehensive enthusiasm of someone who had found the thing that the current moment needed and was going to provide it thoroughly. He catalogued the wildlife of the surrounding region with a thoroughness that served the practical function of keeping the family's thirst managed, while also serving the secondary and, perhaps, primary function of giving him a project which Emmett required in the same fundamental way he required feeding. He pulled Edward into these trips when he could, not with the overt language of concern, but with the casual insistence of someone who happened to be going somewhere and happened to want company, and happened to think that company should be Edward specifically. Carlile observed this and was grateful for it, with the depth of feeling he had developed for Emmett. Across the decades of knowing him, Emmett's way of caring for the people he loved was so thoroughly disguised as ordinary activity, so completely free of the emotional vocabulary that more verbally expressive people use to signal their care, that it was possible to miss it entirely if you were not looking for it in the right register. Carlile was always looking for it in the right register. Every hunting plan that included Edward's name was a form of sustained practical love, expressed through the medium Emmett had mastered, which was the medium of showing up. Rosalie was the family member he found most difficult to read during this period, which was not unusual. Rosalie had always required more patient attention than the others to read accurately, her interior life protected by layers of composure and deliberate self-presentation that had been constructed across nearly 90 years of managing a grief she could not set down. But there was something in the Ithaca months that produced in her a quality he had not previously encountered in quite this form, a kind of subdued and private reckoning that was distinct from her ordinary guardedness. She was not unkind during this period, which was itself a data point worth noting. She was not performing the surface warmth that could occasionally substitute for genuine engagement when genuine engagement was too costly. She was simply present in the household with a quality of thoughtfulness that suggested she was sitting with something real and was choosing to sit with it privately rather than share it. He did not push. He made himself available to Rosalie in the way he always made himself available to her, consistently, without pressure, without the expectation of reciprocity that made some people's care feel like a transaction. He had been doing this for nearly 90 years, since the night he had found her in Rochester and made the decision that had changed both their lives irrevocably, and he had long since made peace with the fact that Rosalie received care on her own timeline and in her own terms, and that the receiving, when it finally came, was genuine precisely because it had not been forced. Esme remained his primary concern and his primary comfort across all of it, and the dual nature of that the same person could be both the one he worried most about and the one who most reliably steadied him, had long since ceased to feel paradoxical. This was what genuine partnership produced across sufficient time, a relationship so thoroughly interwoven that the distinction between giving and receiving became imprecise, because the care moved in both directions simultaneously and continuously, not in discrete transactions, but as a constant current. He was honest with her in those months in the ways he could not always be honest with the rest of the family, because the family needed his steadiness, and steadiness required a certain management of the full depth of his fear. With Esme, in the private hours of the evenings when the house had settled and the day's performance of functionality could be set aside, he allowed himself the honest account. He told her what he feared for Edward, not the managed, measured version he offered when others asked, but the full version, the one that named the specific quality of darkness he had heard in Edward's careful letters and seen in the trajectory of the months preceding the departure from Forks. She listened to it fully and held it with him, rather than attempting to soften it, which was what he needed from her, and which she understood without being told. The letters from Edward arrived with an irregularity that was itself informative. 3 in the first month, then a gap of nearly 2 weeks, then one brief note with a postmark from a city in Brazil that Carlile could not entirely make out, then Argentina, then a silence of 3 weeks that he managed by returning to the hospital on days he had intended to take off, by extending his rounds beyond what the schedule required, by giving his hands and his attention to the work that was available, because the work that mattered most was unreachable from Ithaca. He read each letter in his study, alone, in the late hours after the rest of the household had settled. He read them with the full dual attention he brought to anything Edward produced. The surface content, which was spare and controlled and revealed almost nothing, and the subtext, which was available to someone who had been reading Edward for 86 years and understood what his careful letters meant. The care itself was the evidence. The precise management of every sentence, the way each one was constructed to say exactly enough and nothing more, the complete absence of the unguarded expression that appeared in Edward's communication when he was genuinely well. All of it read, to Carlyle's long experience of his son, as the written equivalent of a wound being carefully bandaged. The bandage was neat. That did not mean the wound was healed. His responses were deliberate in a different way. Deliberate in the direction of ordinary life, of the specific and unremarkable details of the Ithaca days, because he understood that ordinary detail was a form of connection across distance. He told Edward about a patient whose case had been particularly interesting, about a modification Esme had made to the house's east-facing windows, about a trail Emmett had found in the hills north of the city that had produced a surprisingly challenging hunt. He told him, in each letter, without elaboration and without the weight of expectation, that the door remained open and that the family was whole, and that whole included Edward wherever he was. The piano stood in the corner of the sitting room and no one played it. Carlile was aware of it, the way he was aware of any significant absence. Not with the acute focused pain of something new, but with the low and persistent quality of something that has been missing long enough to become part of the landscape of the missing. Alice had sat at the bench once in the first week, and had stopped after a few notes with a silence that was louder than anything she might have said. After that, the bench remained empty. Esme dusted the piano with the same thorough care she gave to everything in the house. Emmett did not look at it directly when he crossed the room, which was the most honest thing any of them did about it. Carlile stood beside it one evening alone, his hand resting on the closed lid, the wood smooth and cool beneath his palm. He stood there for a while, not thinking in any directed way, but simply being present with what the piano was in this period of their life. The silence of it, the waiting quality of it, the way it held the shape of Edward's absence, the way certain objects hold the shape of certain people. He thought about Edward learning to play in the months after his transformation in Chicago, when everything human had seemed lost and music had turned out to be the thing that was not. He thought about the Fawkes house and the late nights, and the sound of it moving through the rooms when everyone else was quiet. He lifted his hand from the lid. He went back to his study. He opened the letter to Edward that he had been working on for 2 days, and he found the next true thing he had to say, and he wrote it down. The vision took Alice in the middle of an ordinary evening. Carlile was in his study when it happened. The door open in the way he kept it open during the hours he was home. The habit of availability that he had maintained across the years as a signal to the family that the study was not a place of retreat, but a place of presence. He heard Alice go still in the way that vampires go still when stillness is not a choice, but a condition. The absolute cessation of the small automatic movements that even immortals produce when they are engaged with the living world, the breathing and the shifting, and the 1,000 minor physical expressions of an occupied mind. He had heard this particular stillness from Alice many times across the years, and he had learned to distinguish its varieties. The brief flicker of a minor vision from the sustained arrest of something larger. This one held her for long enough that he was out of his chair and moving toward the doorway before she surfaced. He reached her as she came back to herself, her eyes refocusing with the specific quality of someone returning from a considerable distance, and he read her face in the first unguarded second before she had time to arrange it. What he saw there produced in him an immediate and controlled response that was the product of 3 centuries of learning to manage his own reactions in the moments when managing them mattered most. He did not show what he felt. He asked her quietly and directly what she had seen. She told him about the cliff. She described it with the precision she always brought to visions she considered actionable. The geography of it, the height, the water below, the figure she had seen at the edge and then falling, and then the stillness of the water after. She told him it was Bella. She told him she could not see the surrounding context with the clarity she would have needed to determine intent versus circumstance, which was itself a significant piece of information, because Alice's difficulty seeing Bella clearly had been a consistent feature of her gift since Bella first entered their lives. Something about Bella resisted the clarity of Alice's sight in ways that neither of them had ever been able to fully account for. And that resistance meant that what Alice had seen was fragmentary in exactly the ways that mattered most. She had the image. She did not have the story around it. Carlyle's physician's response engaged first, which was not a suppression of his emotional response, but a sequencing of it. The long-practiced discipline of dealing with the information before dealing with the feeling about the information, because the feeling, however legitimate and however large, wasn't useful until the information had been properly assessed. He asked her the questions that the image required. What was the quality of the water? What was the surrounding environment? What time of day did the vision carry? Was there anyone else present? He asked them in the measured cadence of a clinician taking a history, and Alice answered them with the frustrated precision of someone who understood why the questions were being asked and was giving everything she had to answering them accurately. What he assembled from her answers was a picture with significant gaps. Bella at the edge of a cliff above deep water, the fall, the stillness afterward, no clear indication of intent, no clear indication of outcome beyond the stillness, which was the detail that Alice's voice caught on, the detail that had sent her into this particular quality of distress. He sat with the assembled picture for a moment that was longer than it appeared from the outside. He was running through what he knew, not about the vision, but about Bella Swan across the months since they had left Forks. He knew less than he would have liked. He had made a deliberate choice not to gather information about Bella's condition after their departure, partly because the gathering of that information would have required channels that were not cleanly available to him, and partly because he had understood, with the clear-eyed honesty he tried to bring to his own motivations, that knowing and not being able to act would be its own form of suffering without the compensating usefulness that suffering sometimes offered. He had not known, and now Alice had seen something that made not knowing untenable. He told Alice that they needed to consider the full range of what the vision might mean before acting on the most alarming interpretation. He said this not to minimize what she had seen, but because acting on incomplete information in the direction of maximum alarm was how crises compounded. And he had seen enough crises compound across 3 centuries to have developed a genuine and practiced commitment to the intermediate step of assessment. Alice received this with the difficulty that people always receive the counsel of measured response when their own response is nowhere near measured, which was understandable, and he did not ask her to feel differently than she felt. He only asked her to think alongside him for the time the thinking required. The conversation that followed was careful and thorough, and at the end of it, there was only one action clearly available. Alice needed to go to Forks. Whatever the cliff vision meant, whatever its context and its outcome, the only way to obtain information sufficient to respond appropriately was direct observation. Everything else was the management of uncertainty, and the uncertainty had become too large to manage from Ithaca. He watched her leave with the specific feeling of someone sending the only available instrument toward a situation they cannot reach themselves. Alice moved with the focused urgency that her particular temperament produced in moments of genuine alarm, the small frame carrying the full momentum of her concern, and Carlile watched until she was gone, and then stood in the room she had vacated and allowed himself, briefly and privately, to feel the full weight of what she described. Bella Swan, alone in Forks across all the months since they had left. He had not permitted himself to think about her with the full directness the subject deserved, had maintained the careful partition between his awareness of her situation and his daily functioning that was necessary for the daily functioning to remain possible. But now the partition was down, or down enough, and he thought about her with the unmediated attention he had been managing away from for months. She was 18 years old. She had lost, in a single night, every person she had come to love in Forks, and she had lost them not through any action of her own, but through the simple fact of being human in a situation where being human was a vulnerability. She had not been consulted. She had not been warned. Edward had made his decision with the best of intentions and the most genuine of love, and Bella had woken the next morning to its full consequence, and Carlile did not know with any precision what those months had done to her, because he had not allowed himself to know. He sat with the discomfort of that now, the recognition that his deliberate not knowing, however reasonably motivated, had been a form of looking away from something that deserved to be looked at. He called Esme before he called anyone else, because Esme deserved to know immediately, and because the conversation with her would help him calibrate the conversations that followed. She listened to his account of Alice's vision with the focused attention she brought to anything that concerned the people she loved, and he heard in her response the same complex layering he was managing in himself. The alarm, the grief, the self-questioning about the choices they had made, and beneath all of it, the maternal instinct that had never fully distinguished between the children she had transformed and the girl her son had loved. She asked what they were going to do, and he told her that Alice was already on her way to Forks, and that they were going to wait for information before doing anything else, and that waiting was going to be the hardest part. He was at the hospital when he learned about Rosalie's call to Edward. He had taken a shift that morning in the way he had been taking shifts across the difficult weeks, as much for the structuring of the hours as for the work itself. And he was between patients when Esme reached him, her voice carrying the particular quality of calm that she produced when she was managing something that required his full and immediate attention. He stood in the corridor of the hospital and listened to what Esme told him, and was quiet for a moment that his colleagues, passing at a distance, would have read as a physician absorbing difficult information about a patient, which was, in its own way, accurate. He did not respond immediately. He had learned, across 3 centuries of situation that demanded immediate response, that the first response was not always the right response, and that the interval between receiving difficult information and acting on it, however brief that interval needed to be, was not wasted time, but necessary time. He used it. He assessed what Rosalie had done, what she had known, what she had intended, what the consequences were likely to be. With the clinical detachment he was capable of when clinical detachment was the most useful tool available, Rosalie had called Edward. She had told him that Bella was dead. She had done this believing the information to be accurate, drawing on Alice's vision in the way that someone not fully accustomed to the limitations and fragmentary nature of Alice's sight might draw on it, as a report of fact rather than a report of a possible future. She had not called with the intention of causing harm. Carlile understood this without having to work very hard at it, because he understood Rosalie, had known her for nearly 90 years, and whatever her complicated feelings about Bella, he did not believe and had never believed that she was capable of the deliberate infliction of this particular kind of damage. The intention was not the problem. The consequence was the problem. And the consequence was this. Edward, somewhere in South America, had just been told that Bella Swan was dead. Carlile knew what Edward would do with that information. He did not have to reason his way toward the conclusion, because the conclusion was immediately and completely obvious to anyone who understood Edward with the depth and the length that he understood Edward. He had transformed this person in a Chicago hospital in 1918. He had known him through 86 years of immortal existence, through the vigilante period and the return and the decades of careful rebuilding, and then the Forks years and the love that had changed everything about what Edward believed was possible for him. He knew what Edward would do, because he knew what Edward valued, and he knew what Edward feared, and he knew what Edward was capable of when those two things, the value and the fear, pointed in the same direction. Edward would go to the Volturi, he would go to Volterra, and he would ask Aro for death, and he would ask for it with the complete and genuine sincerity of someone for whom the alternative, immortality in a world without the person he loved, was not a life but an indefinite sentence. Carlile understood this not as melodrama, but as the accurate expression of what Edward was. He had heard, in every careful letter across the months in Ithaca, the evidence of what Bella's absence had done to his son. The slow and steady diminishment of someone for whom the absence of the right person made the length of existence feel like punishment rather than gift. And now Edward believed she was gone not temporarily, but permanently. And the response to that belief was as predictable to Carlile as any clinical presentation he had encountered in 3 centuries of medicine. He returned Esme's call. He told her what he was going to do, which was attempt to reach Edward directly, and what he needed her to do, which was be available when he needed to make the next decision. He finished his shift because leaving mid-shift would require explanations he did not have time to construct convincingly, and he used the remaining hours to think through every variable available to him with the methodical thoroughness that the situation required. He called Edward from his car in the hospital parking lot when the shift was finished. The call went to voicemail on the first attempt, and on the second, and on the third, and the voicemail itself was a particular kind of silence. Not the silence of a phone that was off or out of range, but the silence of a phone whose owner had heard it ring and had made a decision. Carlile left a message on the 4th attempt. He had prepared what he wanted to say across the hours of his remaining shift, had edited it with the care he brought to anything that needed to land accurately with Edward, and he recorded it in the voice he used when steadiness was the most important quality his voice could carry. He told Edward that Alice's vision had been incomplete, that the cliff was not what it appeared to be, that Bella was alive. He said this clearly, without qualification, without the surrounding context that might have diluted the central fact, because the central fact was what Edward needed to receive first and most fully. He said it, and then he said equally clearly that the door remained open, that the family was here, and that whatever Edward was considering, he wanted him to consider it, knowing that he did not say please. He had made a considered decision not to say please, because please was a word that acknowledged the possibility of refusal, and he was not willing to structure the message around that acknowledgement. He drove home. He did not know whether the message would reach Edward in time, or whether in time was even a meaningful concept, given the speed at which Edward could move when he was motivated. He drove home because home was where he could be useful, and being useful was what he had. Alice called from Forks while he was still driving. Her voice carried the quality it carried when she was managing several things simultaneously, reporting, processing, recalibrating her visions in real time as the information she was gathering changed the landscape of what she could see. She told him that Bella was alive, that the cliff had been exactly what the most innocent interpretation of it suggested. A reckless human physical activity, the kind that humans undertook with the comfortable assumption of their own survival, that Carlile had observed in young people across 3 centuries and had never entirely understood, but had always recognized as a feature of a relationship with mortality that was fundamentally different from his own. Bella was not merely alive. Bella was, by Alice's account, alarmingly unchanged in her fundamental character, which was to say that she had jumped off a cliff for reasons that made complete sense to her and very little sense to anyone who loved her. The relief that moved through him was large enough to require a moment of simply sitting with it before he could speak. He pulled to the side of the road and sat in the parked car and let the relief be as large as it was without immediately subordinating it to the next problem, because the next problem was large enough and would require everything he had, and it could wait 30 seconds while he allowed himself to feel the simple, uncomplicated fact that Bella Swan was alive. Then he addressed the next problem. He told Alice what he had already understood before she called, that Rosalie's call to Edward had already gone through, that Edward had the information about Bella's apparent death, and that the destination Edward was moving toward was Volterra. Alice was quiet in the way she was quiet when a vision was arriving, and what the vision was showing her was confirming rather than contradicting what she had just been told. He heard in her silence the specific quality of someone seeing something they had hoped not to see, and were now integrating with a rapid, unsentimental efficiency that Alice brought to information she could not change. He told her what he needed her to do. She needed to take Bella to Italy. He said this clearly and without the framing of a question, because the framing of a question would have introduced a doubt about the necessity that he did not feel and that Alice did not need. He told her to move quickly, to use every advantage available to her. Her visions, her speed, the specific knowledge of Volturi geography and protocol that Carlile had shared with her across the years of her time with the family. He told her that he would be in contact throughout, and that Jasper would remain in Ithaca, and that the family would be here when they returned. When he said when they returned, he chose the word deliberately, not if, when. He called Jasper next. The conversation was brief and direct, the two of them moving through the necessary information with the efficiency that Jasper's military training and Carlisle's decades of working alongside him made possible. Jasper wanted to go to Italy, and Carlile understood the want completely. Jasper's protective instincts toward Alice were as fundamental as anything about him, and the idea of Alice moving toward danger without him present was genuinely costly for him to accept. Carlile did not dismiss the cost. He acknowledged it plainly and then explained with equal plainness why Jasper needed to stay. Someone had to hold the household. Someone had to be the steady point around which the family's anxiety could organize itself without tipping into the chaos that anxiety, unanchored, eventually became. Jasper was the person best equipped to perform that function, and the family needed it performed. He heard in Jasper's acceptance of this the specific sound of someone choosing the harder thing because the harder thing was the right one, and he held that for a moment before ending the call. He sat in his study that night after the calls were finished, the phone on the desk in front of him, the house around him holding the specific quality of a household managing sustained fear with deliberate composure. He did not try to work. He did not try to read. He sat with the full complexity of what was in motion. Alice and Bella moving toward Volterra, Edward somewhere between South America and Italy, the Volturi waiting at the end of the trajectory with the ancient and patient certainty of beings who had not needed to hurry in several thousand years. He knew the Volturi. This was the fact that sat beneath all the others, the fact that gave the evening its particular weight. He had lived among them. He had been read by Aro, had been known by him in the complete and invasive way that Aro's gift made possible, and he understood from the inside what it meant that Edward was walking toward them. He understood what Aro would see when he read Edward. He understood what the Volturi's response to that seeing would be, and he understood that whatever happened in Volterra in the hours ahead would not be a simple interaction between a grieving vampire and an ancient authority. It would be a negotiation, and the terms of that negotiation would reach all the way back to Ithaca, to the family sitting in the house on the outskirts of the city, to the question of Bella Swan's humanity and what the Volturi's laws had always required of humans who knew too much. He sat with all of this, and he did not look away from any of it, because looking away from the full extent of a situation had never, in 3 centuries, made the situation more manageable. It had only made the moment of full confrontation with it more expensive. The phone was quiet. The house was as quiet as it ever was. And Carlile waited, in the way he had learned across 300 years to wait, not with the passivity of someone who had run out of options, but with the focused and deliberate patience of someone who had done everything available to him and was now doing the hardest thing, which was trusting the people he loved to do the rest. The phone was silent on the desk, and the house was as quiet as it ever became, and Carlyle's mind moved backward through time the way it sometimes did in moments of sustained waiting, not as escape from the present, but as the particular form of preparation that his long existence had made available to him. He had learned, across 3 centuries, that understanding a danger required understanding its history, and that the history of this particular danger was one that only he, among everyone in this family, had lived from the inside. He let his mind travel back to Italy, to Volterra, to the decades he had spent inside the most powerful vampire institution in the world, learning what it was and what it required, and ultimately what it could never be made to become. He had not spoken about this period in detail to many people, and he had not spoken about it at all in years, and the act of returning to it fully now, in the quiet of his study, while Alice and Bella moved toward the city he was remembering, had the quality of opening a room that had been closed rather than sealed, present, preserved, every detail intact. He had arrived in Volterra in the final years of the 17th century, at approximately 50 years into his vampire existence. 50 years was, in the scale of what it was possible to live, barely a beginning. He understood this better now than he had then. At 50 years, he had been accomplished in the management of his thirst in a way that still felt like an ongoing achievement rather than a settled condition, had developed a medical practice that would sustain him across the centuries ahead, and had been moving through Europe with a particular combination of purpose and rootlessness of someone who had found what they wanted to do with their existence, but had not yet found the context in which to do it fully. He had heard of the Volturi through the networks of information that moved through the vampire world then, as they moved through it now, slowly, through direct contact and careful communication, with the unreliability of any system that depended on individuals who had reasons to be cautious about what they shared and with whom. What he had heard was consistent enough to constitute a picture. The Volturi were the closest thing the vampire world had to a governing body. 3 ancient beings of extraordinary power who had established themselves in Tuscany long enough ago that the date had become imprecise even in their own accounts, who maintained a guard of gifted vampires around them, and who enforced a small set of laws that they considered essential to the survival of their kind. The laws were not complex. Do not expose the existence of vampires to the human world at large. Do not create immortal children. Do not challenge the Volturi's authority. The laws were simple, and their enforcement was absolute, and this combination, simplicity of rule, absoluteness of consequence, had produced a vampire world that was, at least in the sense of large-scale catastrophe, relatively stable. Carlile had understood all of this before he arrived. What he had not understood, and what the years in Volterra taught him, was the texture of the thing from the inside. He had arrived at the gates of the city, the human city, the ancient walled Tuscan city above ground, inhabited by the ordinary population of an ordinary Italian town in the late 17th century, and had found his way through the channels that the Volturi maintained for exactly this kind of arrival. The vampire traveller, who had come with the intention of presenting himself, rather than moving through the territory without acknowledgement. The protocol was important. Moving through Volturi territory without acknowledgement was considered an offence significant enough to warrant the kind of response that Carlile had no interest in provoking. The underground world beneath Volterra was one of the first genuinely surprising things Carlile had encountered in his vampire existence, and he had encountered a considerable number of surprising things in the preceding 50 years. The space beneath the city was vast and ancient, predating the city above it by a margin that was impossible to determine with precision, carved from the rock and extended and elaborated across centuries, until it had become something that could only be described as a civilization, a complete and parallel structure, its architecture the accumulated expression of thousands of years of power and wealth, and the specific aesthetic that power and wealth produce when they are not constrained by practical necessity. He had been received with the formal courtesy that the Volturi extended to vampires who arrived correctly, which was to say, through the proper channels and without aggression. The courtesy was genuine in its way. The Volturi were not crude in their social interactions, were not the violent and careless predators that some vampire factions produced. They were in many respects refined to a degree that Carlile had not encountered in the European vampire world outside Volterra, their centuries having given them the time to develop preferences and customs, and the kind of elaborate social structure that sustained time and concentrated power tended to generate. Aro received him personally, which he understood later was not the standard reception for arriving vampires, and which he understood at the time simply as the somewhat overwhelming experience of being the object of Aro's complete and comprehensive attention. Aro was not what Carlile had expected, though he had difficulty articulating afterward what he had expected instead. He was ancient in the way that certain very old things were ancient, not decayed but somehow outside ordinary time, his pale features carrying the particular quality of something that had never been fully human even when it was, that had been moving toward its current form since before Carlile's particular family line had been a concept. He was slight in build and enormous in presence. His voice was musical in the specific way of someone who had had several thousand years to develop every instrument at their disposal, and he was, most distinctly and most immediately, interested, genuinely, comprehensively, insatiably interested in Carlile, and in everything about Carlile, with a specific quality of interest that his gift made both natural and inevitable. The gift was tactile telepathy. Aro could read every thought a person had ever had through a single touch of the hand. Not the surface thoughts available to Edward's gift, the active and present content of a mind in motion, but the complete archive, every memory every feeling, every decision, and its surrounding context. The full history of a consciousness available to him in a moment of contact. Carlile had known about the gift before arriving. Knowing about it and experiencing it were different things in ways that took him some time to fully process. Arrow took his hand in both of the first meeting, and the contact lasted several seconds, and in those seconds Carlile understood that he was being read with a completeness that no relationship or confession or autobiography could replicate. Every year of his human life, every year of his vampire existence, the transformation, the early decades, the long project of building a practice of restraint that no one had built before him, the medical training, the purpose he had found, and the loneliness that had persisted alongside it. All of it available to Arrow in the span of a handshake. When Arrow released his hand, the expression on his ancient face was the expression of someone who had just received an unexpected gift. Not merely surprise. Arrow was too old and too widely read to be surprised by much, but the specific delight of genuine novelty. A vampire who had sustained complete abstinence from human blood for 50 years, who had built a medical practice around the proximity to blood that his abstinence made possible, who had developed a resistance through the pure force of deliberate and sustained choice that most vampires considered either impossible or pointless. Arrow did not find it pointless. He found it extraordinary in the specific sense that it was something he had not previously encountered, and things he had not previously encountered were, to Arrow, the most valuable category of thing. This was the beginning of what Carlile could only describe as Arrow's fascination with him, and it shaped the entire period of his time in Volterra in ways he was still, 3 centuries later, untangling the implications of. Arrow was not simply interested in Carlile as a curiosity. He was interested in what Carlile represented, in the specific proof of possibility that his existence offered. A vampire who did not kill humans was not a theoretical position in Arrow's world after he had read Carlile. It was a demonstrated fact, and demonstrated facts to a being who collected knowledge the way others collected power had a particular and lasting value. He had met Marcus in those early weeks, and the encounter with Marcus had produced in him one of the more quietly devastating impressions of his time in Volterra. Marcus's gift was the perception of relationships, the bonds between people, the nature and strength and quality of connection, rendered visible to him the way physical objects were visible to ordinary sight. He could look at any two people and understand immediately the full character of what existed between them. It was, in theory, among the most remarkable gifts any vampire possessed. In practice, it was the gift of a man whose mate was long dead, whose own most fundamental bond had been severed centuries before Carlile's arrival, leaving him in possession of an extraordinary capacity to perceive what he could no longer himself experience. Marcus's sadness was not dramatic. It was not performed or externalized. It was simply present in everything about him. A permanent and comprehensive grief that had been going on for so long that it had become indistinguishable from his character. The way certain landscapes are shaped so thoroughly by an ancient geological event that the event and the landscape become the same thing. Carlile had felt more genuine compassion for Marcus than for any other member of the Volturi, which was not to say that Marcus was the most sympathetic of the three, only that his suffering was the most legible, the most humanly comprehensible. to someone who understood what it meant to lose the people you loved. Caius was the member of the triumvirate who presented the most consistent difficulty for Carlile during his years in Volterra. Where Aro was fascinated and Marcus was distant, Caius was suspicious with a focused and sustained suspicion of someone whose worldview had no category for what Carlile represented. A vampire who did not drink human blood was, in Caius's assessment, either a liar or a fool, and either option merited the wariness that Caius brought to all things he did not understand and did not trust. He was sharp and cold and precise in his cruelties, which were not random but purposeful. Exercises of power that communicated clearly and efficiently what the consequences of various choices would be. Carlile had managed his relationship with Caius across the years in Volterra through the diplomatic patience that was among his most thoroughly developed capabilities, and had never reached anything that could be described as warmth, but had reached a kind of mutual acknowledgement that was the closest Caius offered to most of the people around him. He had spent nearly 20 years in Volterra, and the years had been genuinely rich in some of the things he valued most. The Volturi's accumulated knowledge was extraordinary. Their libraries, their records, the centuries of documented vampire history that no other source had preserved with equivalent care. He had learned things in Volterra that shaped his understanding of his own existence in ways that were still present in how he moved through the world. He was grateful for this, and he had never been dishonest about his gratitude, even as he became increasingly clear about the reasons he could not stay. The discomfort had grown gradually, as genuine discomfort usually did, not as a single moment of clarity, but as an accumulation of small observations that eventually reached the threshold at which they could no longer be managed as exceptions. It was not the Volturi's enforcement of their laws that troubled him, because the laws themselves were not unreasonable, and their enforcement served purposes he understood. It was the texture of the enforcement, the way that power, exercised over a long enough period by beings with no external accountability, developed its own gravitational field, began to justify itself by its own existence, began to find reasons for its exercise that had less to do with necessity and more to do with the particular pleasure that the exercise of unchecked power eventually produced in those who held it. He had witnessed specific things. He had not catalogued them as indictments, had not been constructing a case during his years in Volterra. He had simply been present, with the honest attention that was his characteristic mode of moving through the world, and what he had been present for had been, across the accumulation of years, more than he could integrate into a life he was willing to maintain. He had left with the deliberateness and the diplomacy that his character required. There had been no confrontation, no dramatic break, no declaration of principle that would have served his feelings better than his purposes. He'd spoken with Aro, had expressed his intention to continue developing his particular way of living as a vampire in a context more suited to it, had thanked him with genuine sincerity for the years of knowledge and community. Aro had received his departure with the gracious equanimity of someone who was entirely confident that the departing person remained, in all meaningful senses, within reach. He had told Carlile that the door remained open, that there would always be a place for him in Volterra, that his gifts and his character and his particular proof of possibility were valued and would continue to be valued. The warmth of it was real. The implicit claim of it was also real. "You are part of my collection," Arrow's warmth said, underneath the courtesy. "You will always be part of my collection. The file is never closed." Carlile had understood this. He had understood it then, in the room in Volterra, with Arrow's hand briefly on his, again in farewell, and he had carried the understanding across the 3 centuries since, and he carried it now in his study in Ithaca, on this particular night, with the phone silent on his desk, because here was what he knew, and what no one else in the family knew with the same precision and the same weight of lived experience. Arrow had read him completely. Every thought he had ever had was part of Arrow's permanent record, and among those thoughts were his feelings about each member of his family, about Esme, about Edward, about each of the people he had transformed and loved across the decades. Arrow knew what Carlisle's family meant to him. Arrow knew what Edward specifically meant to him. And Arrow would read Edward when Edward arrived in Volterra, would read him with the same completeness. And what Arrow would find in Edward's thoughts was Bella Swan. Her face, her knowledge of vampires, her human status, the full unresolved question of what to do about a human who knew what Bella knew. The Volturi's position on this question was not ambiguous. It had never been ambiguous. Carlile had known it since his years in Volterra and had lived with the knowledge of it as the underlying condition of the family's arrangement with Bella. Across the months before their departure from Forks, humans who knew about vampires were not permitted to remain human indefinitely. The secret was not the Volturi's primary concern in the abstract sense. They were not sentimental about it. It was a practical requirement of their ongoing governance, and they managed it with the practical efficiency of people for whom the distinction between an inconvenient situation and a resolved one was simply a matter of timing and will. Edward walking into Volterra was not simply walking into danger. It was walking into Arrow's most comprehensive and most current desire, the desire for gifted vampires, for the expansion of the extraordinary abilities that Arrow had been collecting across millennia into an organization that was already the most powerful in the vampire world, and that Arrow continued to want to make more so. Edward's telepathy was among the most extraordinary gifts Carlile had ever encountered. Arrow would know this the moment he read Edward, and Arrow would respond to it the way he responded to everything extraordinary, with a patient, warm, implacable determination to acquire it. Carlile sat in his study with all of this fully assembled in his mind, not as abstract knowledge, but as the lived and textured understanding of someone who had spent 20 years inside Arrow's world and had never lost the clarity about what that world was that leaving it had given him. He sat with it, and he did not look away from any of it, because looking away had never been his practice, and this night did not warrant beginning. The phone was silent. The house was quiet. Somewhere over the Atlantic, Alice and Bella were moving toward a city he had left 3 centuries ago and had never fully left behind. And Carlile waited, with everything he knew pressing against the walls of the room, and held the patience that the moment required, because patience was, in the end, the only thing he had left to offer. Carlile had learned patience across 3 centuries in the way that people learn anything that does not come naturally to them, through the repeated experience of its necessity, through the accumulated evidence that its alternative consistently produced worse outcomes, through the slow and unglamorous process of making a difficult thing so thoroughly habitual that it eventually relocated itself below the threshold of conscious effort and became simply the way he moved through situations that demanded it. He'd been patient in operating rooms when the clinical situation demanded a speed that could not be safely applied, when the correct thing was to wait for a condition to stabilize rather than intervene prematurely and compound the damage. He had been patient in conversations with people who needed to arrive at a truth in their own time rather than receive it from outside, who needed the space of the arriving rather than the efficiency of delivery. He had been patient across the long decades of his family's formation, waiting for each person to find their way to the life he hoped for them, resisting the impulse to engineer arrivals that could only be genuine if they were self-directed. He had been patient in ways large and small across 300 years, and he understood patience as a discipline rather than a temperament, something practiced, something chosen, something that cost something each time it was exercised, and that the exercise nonetheless made more possible over time. He had genuine respect for it as a capability, the way a physician has respect for a difficult technique that has saved lives precisely because it is difficult. But the patience required by this particular vigil was different from all of those, and he recognized this from the first hour, with the honest clarity he tried to bring to his own condition, and he did not pretend otherwise even to himself. Because this was not the patience of a physician or a counselor or a man waiting for the members of his family to find their way. This was the patience of a father who did not know whether his son was alive, who could not reach him, who could not act, who had done everything within the available reach of action and had arrived at the hard border of what doing could accomplish. Beyond that border was the territory of waiting, and the territory of waiting was where he now lived, and it was the most demanding territory he had inhabited in a very long time. He tracked the time with a precision that had become automatic across centuries of work in contexts where time was not abstract but clinical and consequential. He knew when Alice and Bella's flight would have landed, had looked up the schedule with the deliberate practicality of someone who needed to anchor his calculations in concrete information rather than estimate. He knew the geography of Volterra with the specificity of someone who had lived there for nearly 20 years, knew the approach from the airport, knew the winding ascent to the city gates, knew the underground passages and the protocols and the particular quality of light that existed in those rooms below the ancient streets. He had made the approach himself, from the inside going out, on the day he left, and every detail of it was preserved in his memory with the completeness that characterized all his memories, the decades doing nothing to soften the specifics. He knew the window. He calculated it as precisely as the available information allowed. He updated the calculation as the evening progressed and as the variables available to him shifted. And he tracked the time against the window the way a physician tracks a medication's window of efficacy, with the understanding that outside the window, the intervention became irrelevant to the outcome, and that the thing keeping the window open was beyond his reach to influence. He drove home from the hospital when the shift ended, through the Ithaca evening, the roads familiar enough by now that the drive required nothing of his attention, and left it entirely free for the thinking he was going to do regardless. He thought about Edward, He thought about Aro. He thought about the specific geography of what was happening in Italy and the specific geography of what was happening in his own chest, which was a location he did not spend significant time analyzing under ordinary circumstances, but which was making itself difficult to ignore on this particular evening. He found the house in the state he had anticipated and prepared himself for during the drive. The particular atmosphere of a household that is managing sustained collective fear. Each person engaged in their individual version of the management, the whole thing held together by the shared understanding that falling apart was not currently an option. He had lived in this atmosphere before, across the various crises that a family of immortals accumulated across decades of existence. He knew what it required of him, and he prepared to provide it. He went to Esme first. This was not a choice he made consciously in the sense of deliberating and deciding. It was simply the first thing, as she was always the first thing, the person around whom his navigation of any difficult situation began, because she was the center around which everything else in his life oriented. She met him in the front room with the expression he had learned across 3.5 centuries to read with complete accuracy, the one that held the full complexity of what she was managing, her own fear, her care for the others, the effort of presenting a composure that was genuine in its intention, even when it was effortful in its execution. He went to her and held her for a moment that was not as long as he would have chosen in a different context, and then they looked at each other, and the looking communicated what the holding had begun. He moved through the house in the way he moved through the house in difficult times, with the deliberate, unhurried attention of someone who understood that the attending was itself a form of action, that being present to each person in their difficulty was not a lesser version of doing something, but was, in the circumstances currently available, the most important thing he could do. Emmett was near the tree line at the back of the property, engaged in the physical restlessness that was his characteristic expression of anxiety in situations where anxiety had no productive outlet. He was not running, not hunting, not doing anything that could be described as purposeful. He was simply moving, covering and recovering the same ground with the energy of someone who cannot be still and cannot find the thing that stillness requires. Carlile had observed this pattern in Emmett across many years and many difficulties, and he had come to understand it not as avoidance or as the absence of depth, but as the specific form that Emmett's interior life took when it exceeded the containers that ordinary expression provided. Emmett felt things with a completeness that was not always legible from the outside, because the outside expression of it was physical rather than verbal, kinetic rather than contemplative. Carlile went to him without calling him in, without redirecting him toward the house or toward any particular form of processing that would have served Carlyle's preference more than Emmett's need. He simply went to where Emmett was and walked beside him, matching his pace, and they moved together through the dark at the back of the property without speaking for a while. The silence between them was not empty. It was the silence of two people who understood each other well enough that the understanding did not require constant verbal confirmation, and who were both currently too full of feeling to benefit from the additional weight of having to put it into words. Eventually, Emmett spoke, and what he said was not a question and not a request for reassurance, but something simpler and therefore more honest than either. He said that he needed Edward to be all right. He said it in the way he said things when the performance of composure was not available to him, directly, without the surrounding irony that was his characteristic social mode, with the full vulnerability of someone who has been quietly terrified for hours and has reached the point where the terror is larger than the effort of concealing it. Carlile received this with the full attention it deserved, without trying to convert it into reassurance or information, without reaching for the hopeful probabilities that were available to him, and would have been a deflection from what Emmett had actually offered. He said that he understood. He said that he needed that too. And Emmett looked at him, and something in the looking shifted, and they walked a little further in the silence that had changed quality, and then they went inside. Jasper was in the sitting room, positioned with the unconscious tactical awareness that his military history had installed so thoroughly it had become his natural relationship to any interior space. At the center, with sight lines to the entrances, in the position from which the most could be monitored and managed. He was doing what Jasper did in household crises, which was the difficult and costly and largely invisible work of managing the emotional climate of the rooms through his empathic gift, maintaining a calibration that served as a stabilizing presence without crossing into manipulation. Carlile understood from long observation of Jasper across many different circumstances what this cost him, not the mechanics of it, because the mechanics were Jasper's to understand and not his to presume expertise about, but the toll of it, the sustained contact with everyone else's fear that managing it required, the specific difficulty of processing his own considerable anxiety about Alice, while simultaneously absorbing and moderating everyone else's. He sat with Jasper and told him plainly that what he was doing was necessary and was seen and was valued. Jasper received this with the characteristic stiffness of someone whose service was not often named directly, who had learned to offer it without expecting acknowledgement, and had consequently built a relationship to acknowledgement that was slightly uncomfortable when it arrived. Carlile did not push beyond the statement. He had made it, and Jasper had heard it, and the hearing was what mattered. He added, because it was true and because Jasper deserved to hear it, that Alice was the most capable person he could have sent to Italy, that her gift and her speed and her specific knowledge of the Volturi's geography gave her advantages that most people in that situation would not have had, and that he believed, with the honest conviction of someone who had assessed the situation as carefully as his information allowed, that she would be all right. Jasper was quiet for a moment, then he nodded once, and Carlile understood that the nod was not agreement in the intellectual sense, but something closer to the decision to let the belief be present rather than crowded out by the fear. Rosalie was in the room she had made her own in the Ithaca house, the door in the intermediate position that was neither the full openness of welcome nor the clear statement of a closed door, but something between them that Carlile had learned to read as, I am here and I am not entirely alone in being here, and I am not yet able to be more accessible than this. He entered without asking and sat without ceremony, and they looked at each other across the room with the directness that had always characterized their relationship when it was at its most honest. He did not speak about the call to Edward. She knew the full scope of what the call had set in motion, and she had been sitting with the knowledge of it since the moment it became clear that Rosalie's information had been incomplete, that Alice's vision had been misread, that the chain of events the call had triggered was real and was in motion and could not be recalled. He understood the weight of this with a specificity that came from knowing Rosalie for nearly 90 years, from understanding the particular architecture of her conscience, which was not absent, had never been absent, despite what the surface sometimes suggested, but which was private and rigorous and entirely self-directed, not requiring outside input to be fully active. What she needed from him in this room was not the conversation about intention and consequence, which was a conversation she was already having with herself in far more exacting terms than he would have applied. What she needed was what he had given Emmett and what he had given Jasper in their different registers. The simple and sustained evidence of his presence. The physical and relational confirmation that whatever was happening and whatever she was carrying, she was not outside the family, had not been placed outside the family by what she had done, would not be placed outside the family by any version of how this night ended. He sat with her and offered this without making it explicit, because making it explicit would have required her to respond to it, and response was not what the moment asked for. Presence was what the moment asked for, and presence was what he gave. And when he left the room some time later, she looked fractionally less like someone holding themselves together against a force that might exceed their capacity, and he carried that small evidence of having been useful with the gratitude of someone for whom small evidences of usefulness were, on the worst evenings, the best available comfort. The house settled into the long middle of the vigil, not the acute early phase of alarm, which had its own energizing quality, but the sustained and draining middle hours when nothing new was happening, and the waiting was simply the condition of existence for the foreseeable future. He moved between rooms, between people, making himself available without making his availability a demand. He made the tea that no one needed, and that several people accepted because the gesture of it communicated care in the domestic language that care sometimes needed, particularly in houses where other languages had been exhausted. He sat in various rooms for various durations. He tracked the time. The calculations he ran were his company in the quieter intervals, when he was alone enough that the internal arithmetic could have his full attention. He was assessing probability in the way he assessed it in medical situations, not to manufacture certainty, which was both impossible and counterproductive, but to maintain an honest relationship with the range of possible outcomes and what each one would require. The most optimistic scenarios required Alice's gift to have shown her Edward's location with sufficient accuracy to intercept him before he reached the Volturi's inner sanctum. They required Edward, confronted with the living evidence that Bella was not dead, to be sufficiently reachable through his love for her that the confrontation accomplished what reason alone would not have accomplished. They required the Volturi to allow the encounter to resolve in a way that did not immediately produce the worst of the available outcomes. The least optimistic scenarios he also ran, with the same honest thoroughness, because refusing to consider them would not have made them less possible, and would have left him less prepared to respond to them if they materialized. He ran them, and he sat with them, and he set them aside with the discipline of someone who understands the difference between preparing for a bad outcome and dwelling in it. And then he returned to the present moment of the house and the people in it. He was in his study when the call came. He answered immediately, the phone already in his hand, in the way it had been for the better part of the vigil, and Alice's voice reached him across the Atlantic with the quality that told him the essential thing before the words did. The quality of relief in her voice was as legible to him as any clinical indicator, and what he heard in Alice's voice was relief with the specific texture of someone who has been in genuine danger and has emerged from it and is still integrating the fact of the emergence. She told him they had reached Edward. She told him Edward was alive. She told him they were in the presence of the Volturi, which constrained what she could say and how she could say it. And he listened to what she was able to communicate and assembled from it the picture that the available pieces supported. Edward alive. The intervention successful. The Volturi involved in the way that the Volturi were always involved when something significant entered their awareness. Comprehensively, with the patient interest of beings for whom patience and interest were the primary instruments of their power. He told her to come home as directly as the situation allowed. He told her to protect Bella. He told her he was grateful, which was not a word he deployed carelessly, and which she received with the understanding of someone who knew exactly how carefully he used it. The call ended. He sat for a moment before he moved. The relief was large enough to require the moment, to require simply being inside it, without immediately subordinating it to the next assessment or the next action. Edward was alive. Alice and Bella were alive. The window had held. Everything else could be addressed from the other side of this fact, and the other side of this fact was enormously, incomparably better than the alternative that had been present as a genuine possibility for the past several hours. He went to find Esme because she was the first thing, and he had news that belonged to her before it belonged to anyone else. She read it in his face before he reached her. 3.5 centuries produced this. The ability to receive the news of someone you loved from the way they crossed a room toward you, from the specific quality of how they carried themselves, from the subtle shift in gravity that relief produced in a body that had been braced against something for hours. She understood before he spoke, and what crossed her face was the full, unguarded version of what they had both been managing at careful distance since Alice had left for Forks. He told her plainly that they were alive and coming home, and she received it with the completeness of someone for whom the words confirmed what the looking had already communicated, and they held each other with the full force of it, and neither of them spoke for a long moment because speech would have been a reduction. He told the others. The household received the news in the individual ways that the individuals in it received significant news. Emmett's relief large and physical and immediate, moving through the room with the force of something that had been compressed for hours and was now released. Jasper's quieter and more interior, the slight easing of the sustained effort he'd been applying, the permission he gave himself to feel his own relief about Alice, rather than channeling all his emotional processing into the management of everyone else's. Rosalie's silent behind her door, but present in the changed quality of the stillness that followed the news reaching her, the sense of something slightly released. Carlile returned to his study when the household had settled, and he sat in the quiet of it and thought about what he knew was coming. Edward and Alice and Bella were alive and returning, and they were returning from the Volturi, which meant they were returning with terms. The Volturi did not allow significant situations within their awareness to resolve without terms. Aro did not encounter Edward's gift and allow the encounter to end without consequence. Whatever had been negotiated in Volterra in the hours just past, whatever the shape of the agreement that had permitted them to leave, it would contain a condition. And the condition would be about Bella, and the condition would require a resolution that had been deferred since the moment Bella Swan first walked into a biology classroom in Forks, Washington, and changed the entire trajectory of everything. He sat with this knowledge and did not look away from it, because looking away had never been his practice, and this night did not warrant beginning. He sat with it, and with the relief and with the love that made both the sitting and the relief and the fear all simultaneously possible, and he waited for his family to come home. They came home on a Tuesday in the late afternoon, when the Ithaca sky was doing the thing it did in the deep progression of autumn, holding a low pewter light that was neither day nor dark, but something between them. The kind of light that made distances difficult to judge and edges soft. Carlile was at the house when the car arrived. He had arranged his schedule at the hospital with the deliberate care of someone who understood that the arriving was not an event he was willing to miss, had managed the necessary adjustments without explaining their necessity, and had spent the hours of waiting in the house rather than in his study, moving between rooms with the restless attentiveness of someone whose body had not yet received the message that the acute phase of the crisis was over. He heard the car before it reached the drive. He heard Alice's voice, low and rapid, the particular cadence of someone delivering a summary to multiple people simultaneously. He heard Bella's heartbeat, which was the sound he had been most specifically listening for since the call from Volterra, the sound that confirmed in the most immediate physical register that she was alive and present and close. And he heard, beneath both of these, the sound that he had been managing the hope of for months, Edward's footsteps, the specific quality of them, the weight and pace that were as familiar to him as any sound in his long existence. He was at the door when they reached it. His physician's assessment of Edward began before the door fully opened, in the automatic and pre-conscious way that 3 centuries of medical training had made his first response to any person he loved who had been through something significant. The assessment was rapid and comprehensive, and arrived in his awareness as a complete picture before he had consciously decided to look. Edward's eyes were dark, darker than they should have been, darker than the weeks before their departure from Forks had made them, which had themselves been darker than Carlile had been comfortable with. This was months of inadequate feeding made visible in the most direct way his physiology allowed, the depletion written into the color of his eyes with the legibility of any clinical indicator. His frame carried the evidence of the same depletion in the way that vampires carried such evidence, not in the dramatic physical diminishment of human starvation, but in a quality of presence, a subtle reduction in the density and the vitality that adequate feeding produced. He was functional. He was not well. The physician's assessment said both of these things simultaneously and with equal clarity, and then the physician's assessment stepped back, because this was not a patient, this was his son, and his son was standing in the doorway of the Ithaca house alive, which was the fact that everything else organized itself around, the fact against which every other observation was a secondary detail. Carlile stepped forward and put his hands on Edward's shoulders, and they looked at each other for a moment that did not require speech and did not receive it. Edward's face, in that moment, was not the careful blankness that had characterized the weeks before his departure from Forks. It was something rawer than that, something less managed, the face of someone who had been through the full extent of what the past months had contained and was standing on the other side of it without yet having fully processed the fact of the standing. There was in it the specific quality of someone who had believed, genuinely and completely, that they would not be here, and who was still integrating the information that they were. Carlile pulled him close, and Edward allowed it, and the allowing itself was information. The slight easing of the careful rigidity that Edward maintained when he was managing more than he could carry. The small physical evidence of someone permitting themselves, for a moment, to be held rather than holding. Esme reached him next. Carlile stepped back to give her this, understanding without deliberation that the reunion between Esme and Edward was his own complete and necessary thing, and did not require his presence within it. He watched from a slight distance as she took Edward's face in her hands and looked at him in the way that Esme looked to people she loved when she was assessing their condition with the full force of her maternal attention, which was an assessment as thorough in its own way as any clinical evaluation and considerably less restrained in its expression. What crossed Edward's face when she touched him was the thing that Carlile had hoped to see and had not permitted himself to count on: a softening, a genuine and unguarded response to being looked at with that specific quality of love. The response of someone who has been alone for a long time with the weight of their own interior and has just been reminded that they are not required to carry it alone. He turned his attention to Bella, while Esme held Edward, because Bella also deserved his attention, and because the physician in him had been conducting a secondary assessment of her from the moment the door opened, and had several observations that merited direct confirmation. She was physically intact in the ways that mattered most. No acute injuries, no obvious signs of significant physical trauma from whatever the Italy trip had involved. But she was tired in the deep way that went beyond the surface tiredness of travel or disrupted sleep. The way that people were tired when they had been frightened at a genuine and sustained level, and the fear had finally resolved, and the body was presenting its bill for the resources the fear had consumed. She was watching Edward with the specific quality of attention that Carlile had observed in her many times across the months when she had been in Forks and Edward had been in her life. The total, unself-conscious focus of someone for whom the object of their attention is the primary fact of their environment, everything else receding to peripheral. The relief in her face looking at Edward was not the relief of a narrow escape from a bad situation. It was the relief of someone who had been living for months in the specific poverty of his absence, and was only now, standing in this room, beginning to understand that the poverty was over. Carlile found a quiet moment with her before the fuller family gathering took its shape. A brief and private interval in which he was able to speak with her directly about the immediate practicalities, whether she had eaten, whether she had slept on the return journey, whether there was anything she needed that the house could provide. She answered with the characteristic directness she brought to practical questions, the self-awareness that had always made her an unusually easy person to take care of in the clinical sense. She was hungry and tired, and she was all right, she said. And she said all right with a specific emphasis of someone who means it rather than performing it. He believed her because he had become, across the months of knowing Bella Swan, reasonably skilled at distinguishing between the two. The family gathered in the main room in the way that the family gathered after difficult periods, not with the formal arrangement of a meeting or the orchestrated quality of a planned reunion, but with the organic drift of people who have been scattered and are now finding their way back to the same space, each arriving in their own time through their own route, the gathering completing itself gradually rather than at once. Alice went directly to Jasper, crossing the room to him with the focused directness of someone who had been aware of exactly where he was from the moment she entered the house and had been moving toward him since before she was through the door. The reunion between them was brief in its visible expression and enormous in its actual content. The specific quality of two people who have been through something significant and whose reunion carries the full weight of everything the separation contained. Emmett's approach to Edward was the approach Emmett brought to all his most important emotional transactions, which was to say it was loud and physical, and appeared, to anyone unfamiliar with the medium, to be something other than what it was. The impact of Emmett's embrace was the kind that most people in Edward's physical condition would have found destabilizing, and which Edward received with a slight stagger and the fractional almost smile that Carlile read as the most authentic expression of relief he had seen from Edward since the door opened. Emmett said several things during the embrace that were, on their surface, jokes about Edward's dramatic tendencies and poor planning, and which were, beneath their surface, the complete and genuine expression of a brother who had spent months afraid and was now, in the only language fully available to him, saying so. Rosalie was present in the room, which was itself the significant fact that she had come to the gathering, had positioned herself within it rather than its margins, was present in the way of someone who had made a decision rather than defaulted into an absence. She did not approach Edward directly, and Edward did not approach her, and the space between them held the full complexity of what had passed, which was real and was not going to resolve in a single afternoon. But she was there, and Carlile noted it with the quiet acknowledgement of someone who understood what being there had cost her and what it represented, and he held the noting with the patience of someone who understood that the rest of the resolving would happen in its own time. He found his time with Edward alone that evening, when the household had moved through the initial reunion and the various conversations and the practical business of Bella's needs, and had settled into something more like ordinary evening functioning. He went to the study, and Edward came to it, which had been the pattern of their most significant conversations across 86 years, the study as the container for the things that needed to be said directly, away from the surrounding context of the family's general life. Edward sat in the chair across from the desk, and Carlile looked at him in the full light of the study and revised his physician's assessment slightly from the one he had made at the door. He was depleted, yes. He was carrying the full weight of the months, yes. but he was present in a way that he had not been present in the weeks before his departure from Forks, was engaged with the room and with Carlile in a way that the careful blankness of that period had made impossible. There was something in his eyes beneath the darkness of inadequate feeding that had not been there when he left. Not resolution exactly, not peace, but the particular quality of someone who has been to the extreme edge of something and has returned with a different relationship to the territory closer to the center. Carlile asked him to tell him what had happened, and Edward told him. He gave it in the complete and detailed way that he gave accounts when he had decided to give them fully, not the managed version, not the version edited for the emotional comfort of the listener, but the actual sequence of events with the actual interior content of each moment. Carlile listened with the full attention he reserved for the things that deserved it most, which was complete and uninterrupted and free of the impulse to respond before the account was finished. He listened to Edward's account of Volterra, the approach, the city, the Volturi's underground world, the chamber where the confrontation had eventually occurred. He heard the description of Aro reading Edward with the full intimacy of his gift, and he felt the specific resonance of that in his own body. He knew what that reading was, knew its completeness and its violation, and the particular quality of being entirely known by a being who collected knowledge the way others collected weapons. He did not interrupt to say so. He held it and continued listening. He listened to Edward's account of what Aro had found, which was, as Carlile had anticipated, Bella's face, her knowledge, the full unresolved question of her status. He listened to the account of Aro's response, which had been exactly the response Carlyle's 3 centuries of knowing Aro had prepared him to anticipate. Not violence, not the blunt instrument of simple refusal, but the elegant application of interest, the desire for Edward's gift expressed as the natural conclusion to a conversation that had been moving toward it from the beginning, the offer of a place in the guard, the alternative condition, the particular quality of Aro's warmth, which was real and which was also a form of pressure, because Aro had never needed crude force when warmth served the same purpose with considerably less friction. He listened to the condition. Bella's human status required resolution within a time frame that the Volturi considered reasonable, which was the diplomatic formulation of an ultimatum that had no diplomatic exit. She would be transformed, or she would be killed. The Volturi did not make this distinction with particular emotional weight in either direction. It was a practical requirement, stated with a practical efficiency of beings for whom the distinction between an inconvenient situation and a resolved one was simply a question of timing and will. Carlile sat with the full weight of this after Edward finished. He did not respond immediately, because the immediate response that was available to him was not the response the moment required. He felt the full complexity of what the condition meant, felt it as a physician and as a father and as a man who had spent 3 centuries developing a moral framework for his own existence, and who was now being required to apply that framework to a decision that the framework had not been designed to accommodate. He had always believed transformation should be a gift freely given and freely chosen. The Volturi had made it a deadline. The distance between those 2 things was not nothing. It was, in fact, everything. He told Edward what he thought, which was his practice, and had always been his practice in the conversations that mattered. He said that the condition was real and that they would honor it, not because the Volturi's authority compelled them, but because the alternative to honoring it placed Bella in a danger that none of them were willing to accept. He said that the transformation question had been approaching for a long time, and that the Volturi's involvement had not created the question. It had only removed the luxury of indefinite deferral. The question was the same question it had always been. The timeline was what was new. Edward was quiet for a long moment after this. Then he said that Bella wanted it. He said this not as information he was delivering, but as something he was sitting with, something that continued to require his ongoing processing. The fact that Bella's desire for transformation was not a response to the Volturi's condition, but a pre-existing certainty that had preceded it by months. He said it with the specific complexity of someone who loves a person and wants to give them what they want, and is also aware with a completeness that love did not dissolve, of the full weight of what giving her this would mean. Carlile received this with the recognition it deserved. He told Edward that Bella's desire was relevant, that it mattered enormously, in fact, that it was the difference between a transformation performed under compulsion and a transformation performed in response to a clear and informed and sustained request. He told Edward that there was time to be thoughtful about this, that the Volturi's timeline was not tomorrow, and that the thoughtfulness was what the decision deserved. He watched Edward across the days following the return with the ongoing attention he brought to his recovery, tracking the gradual improvement in the darkness of his eyes as he fed, noting the slow return of a quality of presence that the months away had diminished. He watched him with Bella, and what he saw there continued to be the most immediate evidence available of what Bella's survival meant to Edward's recovery. The way Edward's whole bearing changed when she was near, the specific easing of the sustained tension he carried when she was in the room, the quality of attention he gave her that communicated clearly that she wasn't simply someone he loved, but someone whose existence had become the primary fact around which his own existence organized itself. He sat with Esme in their room on the third evening after the return, when the house had quieted and the day's considerable events had settled into the particular piece of a household that has come through something and knows it has come through it. He gave her the honest account he had not given in full to anyone else. The full depth of the fear during the vigil, the specific terror of the hours when he did not know whether Edward was alive, the relief that had arrived with Alice's call, and that he had still not entirely finished feeling 3 days later. She listened to all of it with the complete attention she gave to the things that mattered most to him, and when he finished, she said nothing for a moment. And then she said that she had known, during the vigil, that he was more frightened than he was allowing anyone to see. She said this without accusation, with the simple statement of someone who knew him completely and was acknowledging the knowing. He told her she was right. She took his hand, and they sat together in the quiet of the evening, and the sitting was enough. Carlisle convened the family meeting on a Sunday evening, 9 days after Edward and Alice and Bella had returned from Volterra. He chose the timing with the deliberateness he brought to anything that required the full attention of the people involved, waiting until the acute phase of the return had settled, until the household had moved through the immediate relief and the practical re-establishment of ordinary functioning until each person had had sufficient time to process the events of the past weeks at their own pace and in their own way. He had learned across many decades of family life that significant conversations held too soon after significant events tended to be conversations about the events rather than about the question the events had raised, and the question this meeting needed to address deserved to be approached on its own terms. He gathered them in the main room of the Ithaca house, the room that Esme had worked hardest on in the weeks following their arrival, that now had the quality of a space that had been thought about and cared for and made intentionally habitable. He had not announced the meeting with formal language, had not used words that would have made it feel more procedural than it needed to feel. He had simply asked each person individually to be in the main room that evening, and the asking had been enough. They assembled in the way his family assembled, gradually, in their own time, each person finding their position in the room, with the unconscious arrangement that groups of people who know each other well develop across shared time. Esme on the sofa, close to where Carlile would stand. Alice beside Jasper, her hand in his, with the automatic ease of two people whose physical proximity had become as natural as breathing once was. Emmett in the largest chair, his frame filling it with the comfortable sprawl of someone who had never quite made peace with furniture designed for human proportions. Rosalie near the window, positioned with a slight distance from the center that was her characteristic spatial relationship to family gatherings when the subject matter made her uncertain of her own responses. Edward in the chair near the fireplace, not quite still, his fingers moving in the small patterns against his knee that Carlile recognized as the physical expression of thoughts moving too quickly to be fully contained. Bella was present. This had been Carlyle's considered decision, and he had not made it without examining it carefully from several angles. She was the subject of the conversation in the most immediate sense, which created an argument for her absence. The argument that decisions of this nature were more cleanly made without the person most affected by them in the room, that the presence of that person introduced pressures, however unintentional, that could distort the decision-making process. He had sat with this argument and had ultimately set it aside because the counter-argument was stronger. Bella was not a passive subject. She was the person with the most direct stake in the outcome, and the outcome would be enacted upon her body and her life, and excluding her from the conversation about it would have been a specific form of disrespect that he was not willing to practice. She sat near Edward, close enough that the proximity was clearly chosen rather than incidental. Carlile stood and spoke to the room with the directness he used when directness was the appropriate register, which he had found across 3 centuries was more often than people generally assumed. He explained what the meeting was and what it was not. It was a family conversation about a decision of significance, conducted with the understanding that everyone in the room had a voice, and that the voice of each person mattered. It was not a debate about whether Bella was worthy of the family's consideration. She demonstrated her worthiness across the months of her relationship with Edward, and had continued to demonstrate it to Ithaca in the extraordinary circumstances of the past weeks. It was not a conversation about whether they loved her, because that was not in question. It was a conversation about whether the family was prepared, collectively and honestly, to take on the full responsibility of her transformation, with complete awareness of what that meant and what it required, and what it could not be undone of once it was done. He said one more thing before he asked for the votes. He said that whatever the outcome, it would be honored, not performed, not superficially observed while underlying resentments accumulated, but genuinely honored. He said this because he meant it, and because the family needed to hear it said plainly, needed to know that the conversation was not going to be a vote in name only, with a predetermined outcome that the vote was meant to ratify. He would not conduct a false process. If the vote produced an outcome that surprised him, he would honor it with the same integrity as an outcome that confirmed his expectations. He asked Alice first. Alice's yes was immediate, arriving before the full question had completed itself in the air. And it was not the impulsive yes of someone reacting before thinking, but the immediate yes of someone who had been thinking about this for longer than the question had been formally posed. She had seen futures that included Bella as one of them, and she described these futures with the careful precision of someone who understood that visions were possibilities rather than certainties, and who wanted to avoid the specific mistake of presenting a vision as a foregone conclusion. What she had seen, she said, was a future that worked. Not a perfect future, not a future without difficulty, but a future in which Bella's presence as a vampire within the family was not a source of ongoing instability, but a settled and genuine part of the family's life. She said this, and then she said that what she had seen in Bella across the months of knowing her, independent of any vision, was someone who had already made this decision fully, who was not standing at the edge of it, but at its center, who had arrived at her certainty through a process of genuine consideration rather than romantic impulse. He asked Jasper. Jasper's yes was careful and preceded by the brief silence of someone who had prepared what they wanted to say and was now organizing it for delivery. He said that his reasons were not simple and that he did not want to offer them as if they were. He said that his primary concern across the months of Bella's involvement with the family had been security, the ongoing vulnerability created by a human who knew what Bella knew, who moved in and out of their lives with the regular contact that her relationship with Edward produced. He said that the most humane resolution to that vulnerability was the one Bella was requesting, and that humane and practical had, in this case, arrived at the same answer, which he found considerably more comfortable than the situations in which they pointed in different directions. He paused and then added, with the deliberateness of someone choosing to offer something more personal than their initial register, that Bella had earned his respect in the specific and demanding way that people who move through genuinely difficult circumstances with their character intact earn it, and that he was glad she would be staying. He asked Emmett. Emmett's yes was large and uncomplicated in the way that Emmett's most genuine responses were large and uncomplicated, carrying the full force of his feeling without the mediating layer of qualification that more self-conscious expressors tended to apply. He said that Bella made Edward better, said it plainly in those words, with the directness of someone stating an observed fact rather than making a sentimental argument, and that an eternity with Edward better was substantially preferable to the alternative. He said that he liked Bella, had liked her from early in her time in Forks, liked the specific combination of her stubbornness and her honesty, and her complete indifference to the social performance that most people Edward's apparent age felt compelled to engage in. He said that having her stay sounded, to him, like the correct outcome, and that he had not spent significant time being uncertain about this. The room received this with a warmth that Emmett's particular form of sincerity reliably produced. He asked Rosalie. The room changed quality slightly when he turned to Rosalie, in the way that rooms change quality when a person who's been holding something significant is about to speak. Rosalie was quiet for a moment. There was not evasion, but preparation. The gathering of someone who had thought carefully about what they wanted to say, and was now committed to saying it without the defensive armor that she sometimes deployed in family conversations. When she anticipated that her position would be received badly, she said no. She said it clearly and without apology. And then she said what she needed to say around it, which was neither cruelty toward Bella nor indifference to Edward's feeling, but something she had arrived at through a process of genuine reckoning that Carlile recognized as the product of the months in Ithaca, during which he had watched her sit with something private and unshared. She said that she did not believe Bella understood, in the way that only the experience of losing something could produce understanding, what she was giving up. She said that the human life Bella was so willing to set aside was the thing that Rosalie would give everything she had accumulated across 90 years of vampire existence to have back. Not the specific life, not the specific circumstances, but the category of it, the warmth, the forward motion of years, the possibility of children, which Rosalie named without the dramatic weight that the word sometimes carried in her conversations, but with the plain and measured grief of someone who had long since moved through the dramatic phase of that particular loss and arrived at the quieter and more permanent version of it. She said that she was voting no, not because she wished Bella harm. She paused here with the precision of someone ensuring that this was received correctly, but because she believed that the vote of someone who had made this journey and understood its full cost deserved to be cast in the direction of the human life, as the one voice in the room that could honestly represent what that life was worth. The room was quiet after Rosalie finished. Not the uncomfortable quiet of a conversation that had gone wrong, but the quiet of people receiving something that had been offered with genuine honesty and deserved the respect of being genuinely received. Carlile held the quiet for a moment before continuing, because the moment deserved to be held. He asked Esme. Esme's yes was warm in the way that Esme herself was warm, not uncomplicated, not without awareness of what the yes carried, but genuine in the full and considered sense of the word. She said that Bella had become part of this family in every way that mattered before the formal question of transformation was ever raised, that the love she felt for her was not contingent on the outcome of any vote, but was simply present, as the love she bore for each of her children was simply present, not earned through any specific performance, but given freely and completely to the person who had arrived and been received. She said that she wanted Bella to stay, not because of what staying represented or what it prevented, but because the specific person that Bella was had become, in the time of their knowing each other, someone Esme could not imagine willingly losing again. He looked at Edward. Edward did not vote. He said this with the quiet certainty of someone who has thought about the question of his own vote carefully enough to have arrived at a clear answer and is not going to be moved from it by the expectation of participation. He said that he could not vote on Bella's future, that she was not his to vote for, that whatever he wanted, and he did not obscure the fact that he wanted her to stay, had wanted it with the full force of everything he was. The decision about her life could not be a decision that he cast a vote on, because the one vote in the room that was truly about her autonomy, rather than anyone else's feeling, was Bella's own. And subordinating that by voting in its direction would have been a form of possession disguised as love. The abstention, Carlile understood, was his own form of the deepest respect Edward knew how to offer. Carlile cast his own vote last. Yet yes, he said it with the same plain directness with which he had opened the meeting, and then he explained his reasoning, because he believed the family deserved to understand the thinking behind the vote of the person who had asked them to gather for the purpose of voting. He said that the decision before them was not simply whether to transform Bella. It was whether the family was prepared to fully receive her, to take on the responsibility that transformation created, not just in the immediate term of managing her newborn year, but in the longer term of being the community within which she would learn what her new existence required. He said that he believed they were prepared for this, and that the evidence for his belief was the gathering itself. The fact that each person in the room had engaged with the question seriously, had offered their honest position regardless of how difficult the honesty was, had treated the decision as the significant thing it was, rather than the foregone conclusion it might have been treated as. A family that could conduct this conversation was a family that could manage what came after. He also said what he had not yet said aloud in quite this formulation, that the Volturi's condition was real, and that acknowledging its reality was not the same as being governed by it. They were not transforming Bella because the Volturi required it. They were transforming Bella because Bella had asked, and because the family had considered the asking seriously, and because the answer the family had arrived at was yes. The Volturi's timeline and the family's decision had converged on the same outcome, but the source of the decision was the family and was Bella, and the distinction mattered to him, and he wanted it named. He spoke with Bella alone after the vote, in the quiet of his study with the door closed. He had asked her to give him this time before she and Edward had any further conversation, because what he needed to offer her deserved to be offered without the emotional weather of anyone else's presence in the room. He told her the truth about transformation. He did this with the complete honesty he brought to any patient conversation in which someone was about to make an irreversible decision, and he did not soften it toward the version that would have been easier to deliver or easier to receive. He described the 3 days of burning with the clinical precision of someone who had watched it happen 5 times and who understood from the inside of the physician's observation what those 3 days actually contained. The pain, which was real and which was unlike anything the human body produced under ordinary circumstances, present in every cell simultaneously and sustained without relief across the full duration. He described it not to frighten her away from the decision, but because she deserved to know the full cost of what she was choosing, and to choose it with that knowledge present rather than absent. He described the permanent thirst. He talked about it with the honesty of someone who had lived with it for 3 centuries and had never reached a point at which it was something other than what it was. A constant, a baseline, a feature of existence that management could make livable but could not make disappear. He talked about the first year, the volatility of the newborn period, the way instinct and thirst operated in concert during that year with a force that even the most disciplined vampire found difficult to manage without consistent support. He told her that she would have that support, fully and without reservation, and that this was not a small thing. That the difference between navigating a newborn year with the consistent presence of people who understood what you were going through and navigating it without that presence was not a minor variable. He talked about the losses. He did this with the particular care that he brought to the losses specifically, because they were the part that was most often underweighted in the conversations that people had with themselves about transformation, when those conversations were conducted from the outside of the experience. The warmth, which was not merely a physical characteristic, but a dimension of the physical experience of being human, that did not have a precise equivalent in vampire existence. The heartbeat, which was not simply a biological function, but the sound of being alive in the most immediate sense. The rhythm that human relationships were built around in ways that were not always visible until it was gone. The ability to be fully present in the human world, to age alongside the people you loved, to share the forward motion of time with them, to be, in the most literal physical sense, the same kind of thing as the people you cared about who were not vampires. And then he waited. Bella listened to all of it with the focused attention she had always brought to things that mattered to her, the complete and unself-conscious quality of listening that was one of her most distinctive characteristics. Not waiting for her turn to speak, but genuinely receiving what was being offered. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment, and the moment had the quality of someone not constructing their response, but settling into a response that was already there. She told him that she had thought about all of it. She used those words specifically, all of it, and something in the way she said them communicated clearly that she was not using them as a general approximation, but as a literal account. She had thought about the burning and the thirst and the losses and the complexity of the newborn year. She had been thinking about them since before the Volturi's involvement, since before the events of the past weeks had made the question urgent. She said that she was not choosing transformation because it was the available option, or because the Volturi's timeline had narrowed the field of choice. She was choosing it because the life that did not include it, the human life that continued forward in the ordinary direction of human lives, aging away from Edward, away from this family, toward a future that was entirely disconnected from the world she had come to inhabit, was a life she was not willing to accept when the alternative was available to her. Carlile sat with her answer for a long moment. He sat with the full complexity of his own response to it. The respect for her clarity, the physician's acknowledgement that she was as informed as he could make her, the father's private and unspoken reckoning with what it meant to receive a request like this and say yes to it. Then he told her that he heard her, that her clarity was genuine, and that he recognized it as genuine, that the family's yes and his own yes were given to her completely, and without the shadow of the condition that had made the question urgent, because she had earned an unconditioned answer. His conversation with Edward that followed was the most delicate of the conversations the decision produced. Edward's resistance to being the one to perform the transformation was real and was grounded in the specific and legitimate fear of someone who understood, from the closest possible experience, what his own relationship to Bella's blood was, and what the act of biting with the intention of creating rather than feeding would require of the self-control that the ballet studio had tested to its outermost limit. Carlile did not dismiss the fear. He sat with Edward in the full weight of it and told him that the offer remained open, that he would perform the transformation himself if Edward determined that he could not, that there was no failure in that determination, that the only thing that mattered about the transformation was that it was done with care and with Bella's safety as the primary concern. Edward received this offer with the complicated response of someone who needed it available and was not yet ready to take it. And Carlile understood this as the accurate description of where Edward was, rather than a position that required immediate resolution. He told Edward there was time. He told him to use the time to come to whatever conclusion the question genuinely required of him, and that the conclusion, whatever it was, would be supported. He spent the evenings of the days following the vote in his study, the house around him carrying the different quality that a decision made produces, the distinct atmosphere of something settled, however complicated the settling had been, however much remained to be navigated in the territory the settling had opened. He reflected on the transformations he had performed across his long existence, moving through each one with the honest attention they deserved. Edward in Chicago, the promise to a dying mother, the boy he had transformed without consent and without preparation into something neither of them fully understood yet. Esme on the table in the hospital morgue, another crisis, another decision made in the margins of death, with the certainty that the alternative was worse. Rosalie in Rochester, the violence that had preceded his decision, the rage that he did not often acknowledge, but that had been real and had informed the choice. Emmett in the forest, brought to him by Rosalie, the first transformation conducted with the willing participation of another member of the family. And now, Bella. For the first time in all the transformations his long existence had produced, he was being asked to consider one in advance, with preparation, with the subject's full knowledge and full consent, with the time to do it thoughtfully, rather than in the compressed urgency of a crisis. This should have been the least complicated of all of them. He sat with the fact that it was not uncomplicated, that the deliberateness of it was its own kind of weight, that choosing to end someone's humanity with forethought was different in a specific and significant way from choosing to end it in the moment when the alternative was their death. Both were legitimate, both had been the right choice in their circumstances, but they were not the same, and he did not try to make them the same, because honesty about moral complexity had always been more useful to him than the comfort of false equivalence. He sat in his study on a quiet evening, the house around him carrying the sound of the people he loved, going about the ordinary business of their extraordinary lives, and he thought about Bella Swan and about the life she was moving toward, and about what it meant that she was moving toward it with full knowledge of the cost, and with the specific kind of certainty that could not be manufactured and could not be performed and could only be the product of having genuinely reckoned with the question until the answer was simply the truth. He thought about what Rosalie had said in the vote. He thought about it not as a dissent that needed to be managed, but as the honest and important thing it was. The voice of someone who knew what was being given up, speaking for that knowledge in the only way it could be spoken for. He was glad she had said it. He was glad it was part of the record of the conversation. It belonged there, alongside the yeses, as the full and honest accounting of what the decision contained. The piano downstairs began, sometime in the late part of the evening, and the sound of it moved through the house with the quality that Edward's playing always had. The completeness of someone who was not performing but existing through the music, using it as the medium through which the things that did not have other language found their form. Carlile listened to it in his study and felt, underneath everything else that the day had contained, the specific and uncomplicated gratitude of a man who had spent 3 months in a house where that sound was absent and was now in a house where it was present again. He let himself feel it fully, without immediately moving on to the next thought. He sat in his study with the music coming up through the floors, and the house around him alive with the presence of the people he loved, and he allowed the moment to be exactly what it was, which was enough. 300 years had taught Carlile many things, but New Moon taught him something that 3 centuries alone could not, that the people you love will break you open in ways that nothing else can, and that this is not a reason to love less. It is a reason to love more carefully, more honestly, more completely. Edward had gone to the edge of everything and had come back. The family had scattered and had found its way home. And Bella Swan, with her quiet certainty and her extraordinary courage, had looked at the full cost of the life she was choosing and had chosen it anyway. That was not a small thing. That was everything. Carlile sat in his study in the deep quiet of the Ithaca night, the house breathing softly around him, the people he loved settled into the peace of an evening that had earned its peace. And from somewhere below, gentle and unhurried, Edward's piano filled the silence. After months of nothing, the music had come back. For a man who had lived 300 years, who knew how rarely broken things found their way back to wholeness, that sound was not a small comfort. It was the whole world. So rest now. Let the music carry you and drift gently into the dark. Good night.